Greetings, my name is Chamomile and this is an exploration of the entire galaxy sector by sector. Today, we're looking at the Castellar sector and 12th Cerulean Spear Command. Partly. This one's actually split between 12th Cerulean Spear and 13th Iron Lance, but I've decided to group it with the Cerulean Spear because it's in the Kashyyyk region, the other sectors of which are entirely in 12th Cerulean Spear, and also Iron Lance is big enough already. Castellar is the first sector I've looked at that has not one but two planets with Senate representation. Chalacta is a human colony world with a population in the tens of millions run by a mystical order called the Chalactan Adepts, headquartered in the Temple of Illumination. There are some reports that the Chalactans are a near-human species, but more reliable sources say they're human and the near-human claim doesn't add up. They clearly look human, and the Castellar sector in general, and Chalacta in particular, aren't old enough for evolution to have had a huge effect on them, without serious pressures. This planet was discovered in the early Republic era, but evolution doesn't get anything done without at least 50,000 years to work under normal circumstances, and while that can be accelerated under the right pressures, Chalacta is not the kind of planet that will absolutely kill everyone who doesn't have a specific trait. Chalactans are people from Chalacta, mostly human, just like Corellians are people from Corellia, mostly human. You might recognize Jedi Master Depa Billaba, a Chalactan who sat on the Jedi Council during the Clone Wars. Her Padawan Caleb Dune survived Order 66 and took on the name Kanan Jarrus and eventually joined the Rebel Alliance. You might have heard of him too. The other planet from Castellar with Senate representation is Sneeve, homeworld of the Sneevels. Sneeve led the Refugee Resettlement Coalition in the Clone Wars, providing homes for civilians displaced by the war, along with 9 other planets, which, that's a pretty small number even if we assume that only major worlds were involved. On the one hand, there are actual millions of inhabitable planets to colonize, but, refugees don't tend to be in a great place to build infrastructure and set up farms on an unfamiliar planet, especially since uncolonized planets are pretty much always planets with marginal soil for farming. There's a reason people haven't colonized them yet. Sneeve was one of the few planets that offered Clone Wars refugees an actual developed planet to live on. You might recognize the Sneevels from Bolla's Roar if you were a fan of the Golden Age of pod racing. Have you guys noticed that there's basically 2 kinds of celebrities, Jedi and pod racers? I thought there'd be more holostars getting into this, but it turns out that holostars are all popular photogenic species like humans, Twi'lek, and Wookiees, and nobody needs me to explain to them what a human is and where you might have seen one before. Yeah, Gaia is a Twi'lek. No shit, everyone knows what a Twi'lek is. Both Sneeve and Chalacta have separate senators within the Galactic Senate, so you might be wondering, is Sneeve or Chalacta the official sector capital? As near as I can tell, the answer is yes. The Republic gave 2 senators to Castellar sector to accommodate the Chalactans, but the Geonosians can go fuck themselves. No wonder they joined the Confederacy. Castellar sector is on the doorstep of Hutt space, which has been a problem for them in eras where the Hutts are more aggressive. During the High Republic era, the Hutts were flexing more in the Outer Rim, and the Jedi were attempting to push back, bringing the prosperity and guaranteed sentient rights enjoyed by the core worlds and Inner Rim out to the Mid and Outer Rims. The Hutts made alliance with the Nihil Raiders, and while the Nihil were clear on the other side of the slice from Castellar, this stretched the Republic's resources pretty thin, allowing the Hutts to move in on Castellar. This was after the Ruusan Reformation, so while the Republic had tons of economic and cultural power, it had almost no hard power, which means if someone like the Hutts decided to swallow the cost of antagonizing the Republic couldn't really force them to stop. Planets like Ubrikia and Ukbat, which are actually over the border into 13th Iron Lance over sector, were de facto annexed by the Hutt clans at the height of the Nihil crisis before the Republic Defense Coalition came together to take them back. The Republic Defense Coalition was, as the name implies, not a central military, but a coalition of several planetary militaries from different Republic sectors. The Ruusan Reformation meant that the Republic could approve of the coalition, but it couldn't spend tax money to equip them or pay their soldiers, and certainly couldn't draft anyone into their ranks, and a lot of the Republic's wealthiest, most powerful core worlds like Coruscant and Alsaken didn't contribute. The Coalition's material situation was so dire that Alderaan was a major contributor of warships. Alderaan? The primary backer of the Coalition was Chandrila, which was more of a military tradition, but the fact that Alderaan even makes the list shows you how limited resources were. The Hutts hadn't been a major military power in actual millennia, though. We're not talking about the Hutt Empire of the early Republic, we're talking about the Hutt clans of the High Republic. Once the Defense Coalition started pushing back, the Hutts retreated back inside their recognized borders. The Jedi's High Republic era push to help the Outer Rim, including Castellar sector, which, though technically in the Mid-Rim, has Outer Rim vibes thanks to the proximity of Hutt space, also led to the restoration of Quen, a world despoiled by heavy mining by the time of the High Republic. The 200-year anniversary of the project was attacked by a coalition of local gangs hoping to take over the planet, which was just the worst plan. Being at the edge of Hutt space means you can get away with some pretty intense criminal activity, especially since this was now the late Republic, when the Outer Rim was pretty much left to fend for itself completely. So criminals trying to coup a sufficiently weak government isn't as insane as it might sound if you spent your whole life living in the core worlds, where a coup at least requires the coups to have, like, mercenaries or a widespread militia movement or something. Gangs taking over a weak planet like Quen was, in general, possible, but attacking specifically on the day when the Jedi were patting themselves on the back for that one time they saved Quen meant that half the Jedi Council showed up to smack the gangs down. After the High Republic's plans to bring Inner Rim standards of living out to the reaches of Republic space failed, though, the Hutt influence returned. By the Clone Wars, Ubrikia and Ukbat were considered Hutt space again. In the Galactic Civil War, a mid-tier crime lord named Bargos the Hutt won the mining planet of Gavos in a game of sabacc, and Dirk Teal, a major world inhabited by a species of near Trandoshans called Saurans, went back and forth from Hutt control from the Old Republic era to the modern day. The Jokali homeworld of Blimp 3 is not in the Republic, so it's maybe less surprising that during the Galactic Civil War, the Hutt set up shop there, but it's still within the boundaries of Castellar Sector, so it speaks to the rising Hutt influence there, that Quaffug the Hutt basically conquered it. There's not a whole lot of information on what's going on in these minor worlds in the New Republic era, but I can't imagine the New Republic is being super aggressive about keeping the Hutts in check, considering they just kind of sat and watched while the Imperial remnants metastasized into the First Order out in the Outer Rim. Greetings, my name is Chamomile, and this is an examination of the entire galaxy sector by sector. Today, we're talking about the Lantillian sector and the 12th Cerulean Spear Command. Two things keep coming up in this project. First, the names of these sectors rarely make any sense, and second, most sectors organized by the Republic are the domain of a specific culture, run in accordance with the customs and traditions of that culture. Lantillian sector is named after Lantilles, which, in fairness, is the largest and most prosperous world of the sector, but Lantillian sector is the domain of the Nazar species of planet Nazri. They're horse-faced humanoids who don't come up a whole lot in galactic history. When I search for famous historical Nazar, the top result is Oral Tok, a Jedi who fought in the Exar Kun War. That's not nothing, but it's not like he was head of the Jedi Council or anything. He was just, a Jedi. Lantillian sector might officially be the domain of these guys, but you wouldn't know it from looking at Lantilles, the most densely populated planet and namesake of the sector, whose population is about 70% human. Lantillian sector was the headquarters of 12th Cerulean Spear in the Clone Wars, but that's not because there's a whole lot going on here, it was just astrographic. When 12th Cerulean Spear was established, it was a military command, an over-sector army tasked with capturing the CIS capital and the Tion cluster, and which was based out of Lantilles because Lantilles is a big enough world to use as a staging ground for the initial attacks, while being far enough away from CIS forces that there was no risk of it being immediately overrun. The Seps had a major material advantage early in the war, and even in the Spinwards front where they were less aggressive, they made some early land grabs to try and build up more of a buffer, and Lantilles was safely out of the reach of that. And just barely out of the reach, too. The CIS launched an attack on the nearby minor world of Braca in the first few weeks of the war. These early weeks were defined by lots of huge and chaotic advances by the CIS deep into Republic territory, which was guarded only by local planetary forces at the time, followed by swift CIS retreat as the clones arrived and the droids pulled back to more defensible positions. At the end of the war, the CIS did make a desperation attack on Braca, a minor world in the Lantillian sector. This is something that happened in a couple of places. See, there's a lot of hyperroutes in the galaxy, which makes it nearly impossible to stop someone from lunging deep into your territory. The reason why galactic armies maintain fairly coherent battle lines in space is not for the reason they do on land, where a sufficiently large army can fortify the entire span of land and physically block an approach. Rather, it's because you will generally get the worst of the fighting if your resupply and reinforcement are 3 days away, while your enemy's is 3 hours away. You have to guess how much fuel and ammo and of what types you'll need many days in the future, while your enemy does not. Also, hyperdrive fuel isn't used to power anything else on the ship, but the hyperdrive does require a bunch of regular battery power too, which is the same thing you use for your weapons and your shields and your sublight engines, and if you burn up a lot of that on your way in, you will be going into the battle deciding whether you want to divert power from your shields, engines, or weapons to keep the other two at full power, while your enemy will be at maximum strength everywhere. This is a problem with being on the attack in general, and you're making it 10 times worse if you pick a route that's 10 times longer. You could pick your way through slower hyperroutes or even jump system to system like the Jedi Explorer Corps did back in the day, but you are much more likely to win if you stick to the really fast super lanes like the Prolemian trade route. But at the very, very end of the war, right before and after Order 66, the Seps didn't have any reinforcements or resupply coming from anywhere, so a lot of them tried launching themselves deep into the Republic for surprise attacks behind enemy lines and hoped for the best. Braca was one of these, and famously Cal Kestis and his master Jero T'Pol were sent to fight the attack off when Order 66 came down, and Cal escaped to the planet below where he hid out for the next 5 years. The whole planet is run by the Scrapper Guild, with broken ships tugged down by the Polemian trade route, and then landed or crashed onto Braca to be torn up for parts. Lantilles itself was never attacked in the Clone Wars, but the TNEs did get that far down the trade route early in the TNEs War, the first major war the Republic fought outside the core, clear back near the beginning of the early Republic era. The Republic weren't prepared for war and lost a lot of ground in the initial blitz, especially since the Lantillian sector and the rest of the Polemian trade route were sparsely populated frontier worlds at the time. Cities make for pretty effective fortresses, and massive civilian starport infrastructure can be converted to host major war fleets pretty quick. In the Clone Wars, the Republic had both in Lantilles, which is why separatist attacks were limited to nibbling at minor worlds like Braca, and even then only under unusual circumstances. In the TNEs War, the Republic didn't have those things, and the TNEs captured Lantillian itself and came knocking on the Republic's door in the Inner Rim. Once the Republic's core world industry turned towards war, though, the TNEs lost their advantage pretty quick. Greetings, my name is Chamomile, and this is an exploration of the entire galaxy sector by sector. Today, we're looking at the home sector of the Wookiees in 12th Cerulean Spear Command. The Wookiees' home planet is the planet Kashyyyk, the most densely populated world of the Kashyyyk system, which sits at the crossroads of not one, not two, nor even three, but 4 different, moderately significant hyperspace routes, which come together to make Kashyyyk possibly the single most important system in all of 12th Cerulean Spear. Thus, naturally, the sector is named after Mitaranor, a planet with a population of less than 1 billion, which is primarily famous as a shadow port for slave smugglers. Generously, maybe Mitaranor didn't have that reputation when the sector was being named, but Kashyyyk was still located in the middle of a bunch of trade routes, come on. Mitaranor is the domain of the Wookiees and is full of Wookiee colony worlds like Raccoon and Kwukar, the latter of which has a special place in my heart because it is the only Wookiee name whose basicization sounds at all like it might be a word in Chiriwok. Say, what did you say your name was again? I'm gonna write that down as Chewbacca. The Mitaranor sector is also home to the Trandoshan species, whose home planet of Dosha, or Trandosha, is also in the Kashyyyk system. The Trandoshans call it the Hiskasi system. Mitaranor sector is also home to Oda, an ice planet allegedly home to the Snorgar people. They live in underground cities kept hot by ancient technology that they forgot how to repair. Luke Skywalker and Han Solo supposedly hid on the planet from Boba Fett and helped extract a rebel spy who was there for some reason. I only bring this up because I have a policy of talking about every sentient species homeworld, even the alleged ones. Let's get back to Kashyyyk. According to legend, Kashyyyk was a planet conquered and terraformed by the Rakatan Infinite Empire in the primordial pre-Republic days, while Tatooine was terraformed into a lifeless wasteland because the Rakatans couldn't control it, so they pitched a fit. Kashyyyk was terraformed to grow hypermassive supercrops, and when the Rakatans died and the wilderness reasserted itself, it was a wilderness of hypermassive super trees. The Wookiees and Trandoshans present different accounts of how the system joined the Republic. Technically, they don't contradict each other, but neither is verified by a reliable source, and taken together, they're a garbled mess. The Trandoshans say they joined the Republic in the early Republic era, while the Wookiees say that Kashyyyk made contact with the Republic several generations later in the Old Republic era, just a few decades before the war with Darth Revan's Sith Empire. And note, the Wookiees don't say they didn't join the Republic until then, but that was the first time they made contact with the Republic at all. So, we're meant to believe that Trandosha was a Republic member world for centuries, according to some calendars, millennia, before anyone thought to pop down to a lush, extremely habitable planet in the same star system to see what was going on down there. And despite having made contact with and joined the Republic far in advance of the Wookiees, it is the Trandoshans who must put up with being represented in the Galactic Senate by a Wookiee, not the other way around. That's not impossible, but it's pretty far-fetched. Weirder things have happened in the galaxy, but all of this goes away if we just assume that mutually incompatible calendars have been interpreted incorrectly and then been cemented into narratives by the Wookiees and Trandoshans, who are locked in an ancient race war that makes both of them extremely reluctant to admit to being wrong about anything, even trivial things like whose calendar dates are more accurate. My best guess as to the order of events here is that Dosha and Kashyyyk were both discovered by the Zerka Corporation in like the same week, probably the same day, and Zerka recruited the Trandoshans to help enslave the Wookiees. Since neither the Wookiees nor the Trandoshans had joined the Republic, none of the Republic protection on sentient rights applied to either of them, and Zerka Corporation enslaved some of the Wookiees with the help of the corrupt Wookiee chieftain Chundar. Chundar's brother Zalbar had broken a Wookiee taboo by attacking Chundar with his climbing claws and been exiled, but he would later return with the help of Darth Revan, themselves exiled from their Sith Empire by the betrayal of their apprentice Darth Malak, and Jolee Bindo, an ex-Jedi self-exiled to Kashyyyk after his break with the Jedi Order. With the help of the Jedi, Zalbar overthrew Chundar and put a stop to the Zerka slaving operation. Kashyyyk joined the Republic soon afterwards. The Zerka Corporation sided with the Sith in the Jedi Civil War, but that wouldn't have been true decades earlier when they first started operating on Kashyyyk. There was no Sith Empire to join at the time. There were a bunch of stray Sith warlords lying around Sith space, which was only nominally controlled by the Republic, but they were so incapable of acting as a state that Darth Revan made minimal use of them, preferring to rely on fallen Jedi. So, although our records don't actually say this directly, my best guess is that Zerka was still a Republic corporation when the Kashyyyk system was discovered. The Trandoshans worked with Zerka for decades before the Jedi Civil War, and that's what they mean when they say they joined the Republic before the Wookiees did. Trandoshans have a reputation for being a villain species, probably because Bossk was such a menace during the Imperial era, but they were Republic loyalists in the Clone Wars while the Wookiees tried to stay neutral for a while. There's reports of a brief CIS invasion during the Harvester campaign, although some historians argue that the Harvester campaign is a complete fabrication. It's very early in the war and the Republic was desperate for stories of victory, so it might have been that some private citizen who was personally supportive of the Republic spun a story about the CIS having a secret Sith superweapon and the Republic's most photogenic Jedi generals destroyed it. It's certainly a suspiciously self-contained series of battles, one in which the CIS try something and fail in such a way as leaves the state of the war pretty much exactly the same at the end of things as it was at the beginning. According to the stories, the CIS dug up an ancient Sith Force harvester and brought it to Alaris, a moon orbiting a gas giant in the Kashyyyk system and which had been colonized by the Wookiees, and planned to test it on the Wookiee population. Anakin Skywalker had been captured on a related mission and Count Dooku planned to feed him to it, but Anakin broke out, sent word to Obi-Wan and his clone army, and the Republic drove the Separatists off of Alaris. The idea that the CIS dug a Sith weapon out of Renvar and Thule early in the war isn't too implausible, but it's weird that they tried to test it all the way out in Alaris. That part of the story seems like a garbled retelling of the Wookiee rebellions against the Empire, which makes me suspect that at minimum that battle, if not the entire Harvester campaign, probably never happened. The Alaris battle of the Harvester campaign is also spishy because the Wookiees stayed neutral for most of the war. They couldn't stay neutral forever, though. For one thing, Dosha declared themselves for the Republic from the jump, which meant their system was going to be a target regardless of whether they were neutral themselves. For another, after the Hutts decided to side with the Republic, or maybe more accurately decide against the CIS, denying them passage through Hutt space, the CIS's plan to link up their spinwards and trailing power blocks shifted to punching through the Republic-controlled mid-rim. Kashyyyk is the crossroads of the mid-rim, so no CIS path through it would be complete without Kashyyyk. You can pick your way through lesser hyper routes, but those routes are slower, and the whole point of controlling contiguous territory is to get reinforcements faster and for your ships to arrive with more reactor fuel for weapons, shields, and sublight engines. The CIS didn't just need any part of the mid-rim, they needed the Randon Run and the Great Kashyyyk Branch, which means they needed Kashyyyk. Kashyyyk was pretty far out of their way, though, and they didn't make a full assault on the planet until the final year of the war, when they were getting pretty desperate to link their disparate enclaves together through the Outer Rim before it was too late. The CIS invaded Kashyyyk, partly in hopes that they could still make the mid-rim connection work, partly to relieve pressure on the Outer Rim sieges in regional capitals like Megiddo and Siskiyne. The situation on Kashyyyk got so bad that Yoda felt the need to come lead the defenses personally. On the one hand, one guy is not going to make that much of a difference. It's not like the Wookiees were unled. Chief Adat Chuk is very well regarded by the Wookiees. On the other hand, Yoda wasn't stupid. He wouldn't have gone there if it didn't feel like a planet on the brink, where a nudge one direction or another could decide the whole battle. It must have been a close thing. The CIS forces abandoned the planet after the assassination of the Separatist Council on Mustafar, though, and the Wookiees got to celebrate a well-deserved victory for, like, a week. Palpatine wanted slave labor to rebuild the galaxy, both to keep popular will on his side as he reorganized the Republic into the Galactic Empire, and to work on various superweapon projects he hoped to use to rule the galaxy through direct force. The most famous of these is, of course, the Death Star, but there's a bunch of others: the Dark Trooper Project, multiple different kinds of Super Star Destroyer, and the general upscaling of the Stormtrooper Corps and the Imperial Navy. There was a bottomless demand for forced labor to complete these projects, and once deeply unpopular separatist-affiliated species like the Geonosians had been exhausted, the Imps turned to species like the Wookiees, good laborers who were loyal to the Republic, but, they could have been more loyal. They only joined the Clone Wars near the end because the CIS violated their neutrality, which is kind of like treason if you redefine treason to include things that definitely aren't treason. It didn't help that the Trandoshans had been loyal to the Republic from the start and had a specious feud with the Wookiees going back millennia. Within 10 years of the end of the Clone Wars, Kashyyyk had been subjugated by the Empire and the Wookiees enslaved en masse, but it was a trouble spot for the Empire continuously. Rebel cells operated to liberate Wookiees from the earliest days of the rebellion because they were a reliable source of powerful and motivated rebel soldiers. The Imperials tried to use the same kind of control chips used on clones to thwart the uprisings, but those things never really worked. For a variety of reasons, they worked better on clones, but mostly because the clones were broadly willing to shoot the Jedi in the back, regardless of whether their control chips worked. Good soldiers follow orders and all that. On Wookiees, who had a much less conformist culture and a much more diverse gene pool, the chips weren't completely ineffective, but the bottom line is they didn't work. By the time of the Battle of Yavin, the rebels had de facto control of large stretches of the deep Kashyyyk wilderness, which they used as fighter bases and safe houses. Despite the Empire still controlling the planet's major infrastructure and running tons of slave camps across the surface, the rebels controlled enough of Kashyyyk's surface that rebels who needed somewhere to lie low while the heat blew over would flee to Kashyyyk to hide out there. After the Battle of Endor, rebel forces were focused on capturing the core and re-establishing the New Republic. This would both deprive the Empire of their primary economic engine, and the Empire was defeated by a lack of credits more than anything else, so losing the wealthy world of the core would hopefully be a finishing blow. And it would also be a significant political victory, allowing the rebellion to firmly establish themselves as the rightful successors to the Republic, a cause that quite a few Imperial sectors would surrender to without a fight. Chewbacca was naturally more invested in the fate of the Mid-Rim and especially the Kashyyyk region, so he and Han Solo took a relatively small force of rebels to lead a general Wookiee uprising against the Imperial garrison. The revolt succeeded, and Kashyyyk became one of the worlds that joined what would become the New Republic even before it was formally declared on Coruscant the following year. Greetings, my name is Chamomile, and this is an examination of the entire galaxy sector by sector. Today we're talking about Tal Dot Sector and 12th Cerulean Command. The Tal Dot Sector is enormous but sparsely populated. It's the domain of the Togorians, a felinoid species with an ancient rivalry with the Mandalorians. Allegedly. These guys are definitely a real species, but most of the stories about them are unconfirmed, including their rivalry with the Mandalorians, and 12 Cerulean Spear's prerequisite alleged story including Luke Skywalker, Leia Organa, Han Solo, Chewbacca, and or Lando Calrissian. Those five did a lot for about 5 or 6 years in the second half of the Galactic Civil War, but to hear the spacers around the Polemian trade route tell it, you'd think they made a point of visiting every single planet in all of Greater Maldrude. The specific story is that Han Solo went on a hunt with the Togorians at one point. That's not particularly far-fetched, but people love to make up stories about Han Solo, so grain of salt. Greetings, my name is Chamomile, and this is an exploration of the entire galaxy sector by sector. Today, we're looking at the Anti-Meridian sector in 12th Cerulean Spear Command. If you've heard of the Anti-Meridian sector, it's probably from old news reports about the immediate aftermath of the Galactic Civil War. After the Imperial defeat at Jakku, it was pretty much every Moff for himself. The 6th Black Sword and 1st Azure Hammer that guarded the path into Coruscant and Coruscant itself were the main source of the Star Destroyers that just got blown up at Jakku, so those guys surrendered and the Rebel fleet flew in to establish the New Republic without any further conflict. With no central government left to give commands and a population of oppressed peoples who couldn't wait to lynch Imperial officers, the Moffs and Grand Moffs were desperate for either New Republic protection from their own rebellious populations, or else to maintain control as an Imperial remnant. These Imperial remnants, much like the CIS holdouts at the end of the Clone Wars, were politically aligned but economically and militarily cut off from one another, which means if the New Republic came after one remnant, that remnant was on their own. None of the other remnants would be coming to provide backup. That's why the Remnants liked to hold together entire oversector commands if they could, and the Outer Rim oversectors like 12th Cerulean Spear were in a position to do so. They controlled space that the New Republic was comparatively less interested in, and Mon Mothma was making a lot of noise about peace and reconciliation. She wanted to distance the New Republic from the rise of the Empire, when campaigns of subjugation against separatist holdout worlds were used to justify a lot of atrocities against Outer Rim worlds, most infamously the sterilization of Geonosis. Maldruud Oversector, the official name of 12th Cerulean Spear after the Clone Wars, officially declared themselves the nation of Greater Maldruud, and tried to position itself as a sovereign power, politically aligned with other Imperial remnants but not a direct successor to the Empire. Greater Maldruud's problem is that their territory included Kashyyyk, Republic loyalists in the Clone Wars who suffered under brutal oppression under the Empire, and Mon Calamari, homeworld of freshly minted New Republic war hero Admiral Ackbar. The odds they would be able to retain control of Kashyyyk's Mitranor sector or Mon Calamari space were basically nil, which put them at risk of ending up like 14th Red Tails or 15th Hook Nebula, who had completely dissolved into independent systems and New Republic enclaves because they had failed to put down the wave of local rebellions that ensued after the death of the Emperor. Greater Maldruud could retreat from Mitranor as a show of goodwill, but all of their most prosperous and powerful sectors lay in between the core and Mon Calamari space at the fringe of dark space, so they had to simultaneously permit free movement between the core and Mon Calamari space as a New Republic enclave, while still showing enough strength to keep any of their other sectors from defecting. The Ante-Meridian sector was Cerulean Spear's border on the Outer Rim, directly rimwards from the Mid-Rim Maldruud sector, the nominal capital of Greater Maldruud, so this was the sector that Cerulean Spear needed to retain control of if they wanted to present a united Outer Rim stronghold that would require major fleet action to crack, the kind of major fleet action that Mon Mothma was loudly declaring an end to. And Ante-Meridian's Moff Kateles had decreed the sentient Ranat species of rat people to be semi-sentient, the Imperial's standard tactic for stripping sentient rights away. After that decree, the Ranats were totally exterminated from their homeworld on Rydar II, and people on planet Auralia had begun hunting Ranat colonies for sport and bounties to clear the way for construction of, no joke, an amusement park. As obscene as it is to conduct genocide for the sake of a theme park, the Imperials needed to keep Auralia from being associated with stormtrooper legions or orbital bombardment. The park's audience was primarily Imperial supporters who thrived under the Empire and loved Star Destroyers and Stormtroopers, but that doesn't mean they were going to go on vacation to an active war zone, so this meant the Ranat genocide had to be kept much lower key on Auralia than on the Ranat homeworld of Rydar II. The Ranats hid in sewers and burrows for a while, so long that the theme park completed construction and began operation. Auralia is in the Outer Rim, but it's not far from the Perlemian trade route, so it gets decent traffic from the Inner Rim and core. Eventually, the Ranats raided one of the theme parks for hostages from the Inner Rim and core to try and negotiate a division of territory on the planet, but this was a good 20 years into the Imperial era, so of course the Empire just flooded the world with stormtroopers until the Ranats were hunted down almost to extinction. Now that Auralia's reputation as a peaceful resort world was already shattered, there was no practical reason not to use maximum force, and of course, Imperials don't care about humanitarian concerns. Every Imperial Moth has some kind of skeletons in their closet, but genocide in the name of a theme park is the kind of crime that even Mon Mothma isn't going to let slide, so Moff Kateles was ride or die for Greater Maldruud. And then Moff Xerix of the Meridian sector next door surrendered to the New Republic. Moff Xerix was pretty firmly committed to the Imperial ideal of being a more disciplined regime for a more chaotic galaxy, focused on law and order. He had plenty of sentient right violations to his name, but he also oversaw a genuine crackdown on Hutt racketeering in the sector. He was exactly the kind of mixed-bag Imperial that Mon Mothma loved to make deals with, and his Meridian sector was smack in the middle of Greater Maldruud. If Meridian sector defected to the New Republic, then the entirety of Greater Maldruud could come crumbling down just like 14th Red Tails and 15th Hook Nebula had dissolved into independent systems after their Grand Moffs failed to put down defectors and rebellions in the wake of Endor. Moff Kateles launched an invasion of the Meridian sector in hopes of rapidly seizing it from Moff Xerix and presenting its fall to the New Republic as a fait accompli and an internal affair. The New Republic didn't play along, though. Mon Mothma wanted peace even if it meant leaving most of the Outer Rim in the hands of Imperial remnants, but she also wanted to protect anyone who defected to the New Republic from Imperial retribution. And Admiral Ackbar was absolutely not going to let a precedent be set that Greater Maldruud, which stood between Calamari space and the core, was allowed to pick off New Republic enclave sectors. Akbar led the rebel fleet up the Polemian trade route to attack the Anti-Meridian sector's capital world of Anti-Meridiaz, and Greater Maldrude threw Gatalas under the bus, disavowing him and his actions. The New Republic fleet was, at that point, pretty much exactly the same rebel fleet that had won at Jakku. They'd taken some losses from that battle, but not so much that a second-tier oversector like Cerulean Spear was going to do what Death Squadron, Black Sword, and Azure Hammer put together could not. And once Greater Maldrude backed down, Moff Gatalas by himself didn't stand a chance. The New Republic absolutely obliterated Anti-Meridian sector's fleet and incorporated both Meridian and Anti-Meridian sectors into the New Republic. This was a New Republic enclave in the middle of Greater Maldrude, but the New Republic had just demonstrated a willingness to send a fleet barreling down the Polemian trade route to protect it, and Greater Maldrude had just demonstrated an unwillingness to confront them. This whole punch into Greater Maldrude saw the whole nation collapse pretty quickly. Anti-Meridian sector is also home to the Kravaki species. They're pacifists who don't really have any major historical figures amongst them, but they look cool. Greetings, my name is Chamomile, and this is an exploration of the entire galaxy sector by sector. Today, we're looking at Jospro Sector in 12th Cerulean Spear Command. The capital of Jospro Sector is Cymirth, homeworld of the Cymirthians, an alien species who, I'm not sure how to describe this. If you're listening to this as a podcast, you're gonna have to tab back. They look like this. Jospro Sector is also home to the Chadrafan, little bat people who live on the planet Chad, yes really, and who never joined the Republic, old or new. Jospro Sector is also supposedly home of the Rydar bat-like aliens with primitive tech who live on the planet Dar-Or, and I think these guys in the Chadrafan are the same thing. They were just described slightly differently by different spacers and had different names attributed to them. Whether they're actually two separate planets of bat people or not, though, none of the Jospro bats ever joined the Republic, which means the sector capital is Cymirth, and Cymirth is basically where the galaxy goes to kill each other. The Jedi fought the Mandalorians there, the Republic fought the Sith Empire there, and in the Clone Wars, Cymirth sided with the Seps, and the clones fought the droids there. The Tion hegemony, just up the Polemian trade route, was the capital of the CIS, and Tion held out against the GAR for the whole war. They surrendered before the clones cracked them open. Cymirth refused the surrender, but without any other sectors backing them up, the clones absolutely demolished them. Toonbuk Tura, formerly the senator of Cymirth, was chased around 12th Cerulean for a while, but eventually the Republic cornered her and crushed the separatist holdout. Saw Gerrera's partisans had a fighter base in the abandoned mine shafts of the entirely depleted mining world of Segra Milo, and Rogue Squadron wiped out an Imperial complex on Kyle 2, and that was pretty impressive for a dozen fighters going against hundreds of Imperials using speed and precision to take on an entire fortress before they could get their plastoid boots on, but it's not much of a planet in the grand scheme of things. It wasn't a major theater of the Galactic Civil War, but Jospro Sector wasn't going to be left out of a war completely. They have a reputation to uphold. And when there's no big galactic wars going on, Jospro Sector makes up some local ones to have instead. The Corporate Alliance tested out their shiny new army of battle droids on a major pirate base on N'Gira in the late Republic era, and Zim the Despot conquered Cymirth and called it Far Barseg in the pre-Republic era. Every single war in galactic history was fought here. I keep expecting to find out that somehow the Chiss fought the Nickerdoon in this sector. Greetings, my name is Chamomile, and this is an exploration of the entire galaxy sector by sector. Today, we're looking at the Maldrude sector in 12th Cerulean Spear Command. In the long tradition of Imperial oversectors being named after sectors nobody cares about, the Maldrude sector is the namesake for the Maldrude oversector, the official name for 12th Cerulean Spear, after it was reorganized from a theater of war to a unit of government at the end of the Clone Wars. Maldrude is less baffling of a choice than most because Maldrude sector is actually middlingly important. Its capital planet of Kentares used to call itself the Jewel of the Mid-Rim back in the late Republic, and while that was self-proclaimed, Kentares does fit right in with planets like Iriadu, Naboo, and Kashyyyk as mid-rim planets that were pretty great places to live. Maldrude sector is also home to the Wheel, one of those space casinos built in orbit over a star with no habitable planets. No habitable planets means no planetary government to worry about, just the sector government and Republic law, so that's one less layer of regulation on gambling. Maldrude sector sided with the CIS in the Clone Wars. The shipyards at Abhayan were a major staging point for the Republic in the Tianese War back in the early Republic days, and the CIS hoped to use them to fend off the 12th Cerulean Spear of the Grand Army of the Republic. And that did not work. Funny enough, I can't find any record of a battle here, though. Did the CIS just abandon these shipyards? By the time of the Clone Wars, Abhayan wasn't nearly as impressive as places like Kuat or Mon Calamari, but they were still a regionally significant barrier between the Republic and the Separatist capital on Raxus. By the time of the Outer Rim sieges, the clones were on the doorstep of the Tion cluster, far past Abhayan. It's hard to believe that the Seps gave it up without a fight, so it seems like Aayla Secura and the 12th Cerulean Spear probably captured at some point, but I can't find any record of exactly when or how. I didn't realize we lost that much information when the Imperial bureaucracy was dissolved. That's nuts. It was only a few decades ago. Regardless of how Abhayan got, it and the sector capital at Kentaris were two of many separatist worlds to face Imperial retribution after the Clone Wars. The planet was strip-mined and the environment ruined. The place is basically a wasteland now. There were some efforts to rebuild when High Admiral Truton Teradok used it as the capital of Greater Maldrude, an independent Imperial remnant nation declared after the Battle of Jakku and the death of the Emperor. Greater Maldrude didn't last long, though. The Moff of the Meridian Sector defected to the New Republic, the Moff of the Anti-Meridian Sector invaded to try and keep Meridian Sector in Greater Maldrude, and when Admiral Akbar came down the Prelemian trade route to liberate Meridian Sector, High Admiral Teradok let him through, and the New Republic established an enclave from both the Meridian and Anti-Meridian sectors, and after that showing of weakness, the so-called Emperor Zinj bid off the Tion cluster, and the whole thing just kind of collapsed from there. Maldrude Sector remains the nominal capital of Greater Maldrude to this day, but no one outside Maldrude Sector cares about their territorial claims, and they definitely aren't standing between the New Republic's core and Mon Calamari's space at the other end of the Prelemian trade route. Greetings, my name is Chamomile, and this is an exploration of the entire galaxy sector by sector. Today, we're looking at Meridian Sector and 12th Cerulean Spear Command. Meridian Sector is the domain of the Grismath dynasty, ruled according to their traditions. Records don't say explicitly, but from their position well behind the Jospro sector that formed the border between early Republic territories in the core and the Outer Rim territory of the Tion hegemony, the Grismath dynasty were most likely a Tianese noble house. The Tianese War went poorly for the hegemony, but not so bad that they weren't able to negotiate a lot of compromises for their subsequent accession to the Republic as a sector. Grismouth dynasty was accepted to the Republic separately from other Tianese nobles as the Meridian sector, and while I'm still forced to guess because their history is just blank for thousands of years, it looks like the Grismouth dynasty probably broke off from the Tion hegemony after the death of their founding conqueror Zim the Despot, didn't get merged back into the hegemony by the honorable union of Tion and Desevro, the way that the Tion cluster and its immediate periphery mostly did, but remained allied to the Tion hegemony, which is why the Tianese border with the Republic was in Jospro sector in the Mid-Rim, and not the Meridian sector in the Outer Rim. Meridian Sector must have had a ton of privileges grandfathered in as one of the very first sectors incorporated into the Republic, though, because in the middle of the High Republic era, they were exiling prisoners to penal colonies on the desert world of Nam Chorios, and when the prisoners grew unruly, they virus-bombed the planet with a plague called the Death Seed. Meridian is an Outer Rim sector, but it's smack on the Prelemian trade route. It's weird that the Grismath dynasty got away with an atrocity that extreme in the High Republic era. Being an early sector that got away with murder, in some cases literally, would also explain why there's so many sentient species native to this sector, none of whom have Senate representation. The Nymerian spaceport in Anem, a capital city of the planet Nymar, is allegedly the most advanced spaceport in all the Meridian sector, but they aren't in charge, Grismath is. The Père Duag are these haunting creatures, symbiotes who are born separately but fuse together as they grow up together, but they aren't in charge, Grismath is. Planet Karamon, homeworld of the Karites, a porcine humanoid species known for their grins, have a mercantile culture and were members of the Trade Federation, but they're not in charge, Grismath is. Helix 9 supposedly has a native population of methane breathers, although I can find no other information, which is unsurprising since they aren't in charge, Grismath is. The Drovians are technically humanoids and native to the planet of Nim Drovis, and that Nim prefix makes it really clear this is a Grismath name for the planet. I'm guessing the Drovians just call it Drovis, or maybe they have a completely different name for themselves. Their traditionalist tribe is called the Gopsoo, which sounds very different from Drovian, and also the dominant Drovian culture who are more integrated into galactic society don't like the Gopsoo, so I guess the Drovian mainstream likes that they aren't in charge, Grismath is? And then the Grismath dynasty died in a nuclear war at some point between the virus bombing of their prison planet and the establishment of the New Republic. They did leave a couple of colony planets behind to pick up their mantle, like Ampliquen. Imperial Moffs had overridden the sovereignty of sector governments at will for decades under the Empire, so regardless of exactly when the Grismath dynasty offed themselves, the actual ruler of Meridian Sector was Moff Xerex. he decided he was going to join the New Republic. He'd focused most of his efforts as Moff on cracking down on Hutt crime networks and the piracy problem plaguing the Budpock system, and while he'd gone about this with the usual Imperial disregard for sentient rights, the fundamentally reasonable goal of fighting crime meant that Mon Mothma was happy to negotiate with him. He was the kind of wrong thing for the right reasons Imperial that Mon Mothma loved. This was a huge problem for 12th Cerulean Spear, which had reorganized itself into the Imperial remnant nation of Greater Maldrude, because Meridian Sector is in the Outer Rim, past Maldrude Sector and Jospro Sector, and a bunch of other territory that Greater Maldrude didn't want joining the New Republic, and now Xerix was putting up a New Republic enclave on the Prolemian trade route that threatened to cut the whole Oversector in half. The neighboring Anti-Meridian Sector had engaged in a bit of light genocide during the Imperial era, so their Moff Gateles was all in on the Imperial remnant. Gateles recovered Death Seed from the surface of the Nam Chorios and unleashed the disease on the sector, paid off a bunch of the surviving Budpock pirates to launch some raids, and invaded the sector with his own fleet as a peacekeeping measure, with the goal of conquering the Anti-Meridian Sector before it could join the New Republic and presenting the conquest to Mon Mothma as a fait accompli and an internal matter. Mon Mothma might have accepted that, but Admiral Akbar certainly wasn't going to. See, Calamari Space is in 12th Cerulean Spear, and although it wasn't one of the sectors officially claimed by Greater Maldrude, they hadn't formally recognized its independence either. It was one of several sectors that they didn't govern, but which were nevertheless within their de jure borders, and which they were implicitly giving themselves permission to invade at a later date. Being located deep in the Outer Rim is what allowed Calamari Space to declare open rebellion against the Empire successfully relatively early in the Galactic Civil War, and now it would prevent the New Republic from coming to Mon Cala's aid if Greater Maldrude was able to crack the Mon Calamari fleet defenses. Admiral Akbar was deeply invested in making sure Greater Maldrude didn't become a major regional power, and that the Prolemian trade route remained open to New Republic ships heading out to the very edge of the galaxy to Calamari Space. So he rammed the entire rebel fleet down Moff Gateles' throat. Greater Maldrude threw Gateles under the bus, and both Meridian and Anti-Meridian sectors joined the New Republic. Princess Leia was allegedly kidnapped and held on the ice planet of Damonite Yours B in this sector, but this sounds like the kind of detail a historical dramatization might have fabricated to punch things up. The historical fiction writers are one of our best sources after Palpatine disbanded the Imperial bureaucracy, but if you believe everything they write, Leia Organa got kidnapped on a weekly basis for 20 years straight, something you'd think would have had a bigger impact on her political career. Also, the Lorenar Corporation was in cahoots with Moff Gateles the whole time. They didn't really do much besides provide credits, but providing credits to pay for a plan to intentionally cause a sector-wide pandemic that could have gone galactic is a fucked up thing to do, and I want Lorenar's culpability on record. But my favorite story isn't about Deathseed or the Lorenar Corporation. Meridian Sector lies on the Prolemian trade route, which means it was sort of in the Clone Wars. It was CIS territory at the outbreak of the war, and was not by the end, but the CIS mostly retreated straight past the Meridian Sector without stopping to fight. CIS garrison forces on the agri-world of Antamont got cut off from the retreat and tried to resist the clone army. A destroyed battle droid was found on the planet sitting under a tree, decades after the Clone Wars. Its weapon discarded, showing no signs of struggle, and an examination of the remains of the droid's circuits revealed that a mutation in the dynamic programming had allowed it to disregard its orders to participate in the battle. This kind of thing happens when a droid goes too long without having its memory wiped, and this particular droid uses its newfound freedom to escape the battle and find a hill to sit on, observing the world until its power ran out. Out of batteries, the droid was functional but unconscious, but also left exposed to the elements. Its circuitry degraded from accumulated moisture damage and lack of oil to the point of being irreparable. In effect, after watching a sunset, the droid slipped into unconsciousness and slept for months before finally dying. Greetings, my name is Chamomile and this is an exploration of the entire galaxy sector by sector. Today, we're looking at the New Eerie sector in the 12th Cerulean Spear Command. If I had my druthers, New Eerie sector would have been an 11th Blazing Claw command with the rest of the Sith worlds, but Republic High Command refuses to change the boundaries of Oversector commands defined 20 years before I was born, no matter how loudly I yell at the clouds. In fact, the story you're most likely to recognize New Erie Sector from splits itself across the two oversectors. The planet Quell is located in 12th Cerulean Spear, which is why it was Jedi General Aayla Secura's problem. Anakin and the 501st Legion were part of 3rd Steel Blade Command, the oversector army commanded by Obi-Wan Kenobi, whose nominal area of operations was located in the core and inner rim, and which basically never had to defend their actual assigned territory, so they spent the entire war serving as reinforcements for wherever was in the most danger. That's why Anakin and Obi-Wan spent most of their time in the trailing sector supporting 14th Red Tails, but if Aayla Secura and 12th Cerulean were the ones who needed backup, then off to the New Erie Sector they went. Too late to do anything except bail Aayla out of a losing fleet battle with the Separatists, though, and Anakin nearly got himself killed in the process. Maybe that would have been for the best. They managed to escape into hyperspace and launch themselves pretty much blind, coming out of hyperspace in the next sector over, which is across the border in 11th Blazing Claw. So don't hold your breath on that one. We'll get to it. Someday. According to rumor, Jedi Knights Flynn Kaibo and Tachuka Da'un got lured into a trap and wrecked by General Grievous on planet Vandos. This one's not as well sourced as the Aayla Secura story, but it makes sense to me. The Republic banged their head against this sector a couple of times in the first 2 years of the war, and it didn't give way until later. There were no Outer Rim sieges here, so presumably the CIS withdrew from New Erie Sector completely, giving it up without a fight to focus on more important sectors in the Tion cluster. Count Dooku had a chateau on planet Vajun, although I can't imagine the constant acid rain made it too great of a vacation spot. Darth Vader also had a stronghold here, Bast Castle, a restored Sith stronghold from the days when this sector was in Sith space. Sort of, the boundaries of that region weren't exact and expanded and receded over time as the power of the Sith Empire rises and falls, but Vajun was definitely Sith space at one point, and that's when they built Bast Castle. If you've seen people weeping, wailing, and gnashing their teeth over what we lost in the original planned storyline of Battlefront 3, that game was to follow the events of X1 and X2, two clone troopers, one of whom became a Jedi, the other a Sith, and at one point the Jedi clone helped the New Republic storm Bast Fortress, where it had become an Imperial remnant holdout led by the Sith clone. I don't know how grounded in actual galactic history this storyline is, but at minimum it was intended as a fictional vehicle for a story that crossed paths with lots of real historical events, including the attempts by some of Palpatine's dark side adepts to consolidate around old Sith sites restored by the Empire on planets like Renvar, Felucia, and Vajun. There was a lot of rebel activity in this sector during the Galactic Civil War. Although New Erie Sector is in the Outer Rim, the rebels attacked the planet Gorman, not to be confused with Gorman, during the Midrim Offensive. Supposedly, the tide of the battle was turned by Imperial AT-ATs. Rebel troopers surrendered after the AT-ATs came down on them, but the locals tried to flee. Rebel Commander Bren Derlin said that he and his troopers surrendered because you can't run from AT-ATs, which, what? Yes, you can. Sure, the length of their stride makes them faster than infantry despite their slow pace, but one, barely, and two, scatter. AT-ATs have a massive turning radius and are super expensive. The Empire never had that many of them. Running away from them is super easy. That's actually an important part of the Imperial intimidation-based doctrine on using them. They're designed to encourage people to run away instead of standing and fighting. The Falinasi native to planet Lukazek fled to the Kornak cluster after Order 66. They're a Force tradition who refer to the Force as a white current. Like a lot of Force traditions, the Falinasi supposedly had access to Force powers very different from what the Jedi and Sith could do. The Falinasi signature power was Force illusions, and when they found sanctuary from the Empire with the monks of Hakug in the Kornak cluster, they used their illusion powers to disguise the monastery as a smoking ruin. None of that's really confirmed, and people like to tell stories about crazy Force powers, but the Empire's efforts to convince the galaxy that the Jedi were charlatans has aged pretty poorly, and there's pretty solid sourcing on the Witches of Dathomir, so it's not just the Jedi. People sometimes get it into their heads that the Force can only grant a very small set of powers because there's so much overlap between the powers of the Jedi and the Sith, but the Sith are a Jedi offshoot, one that's been reinvigorated with fresh Jedi blood regularly. They have similar powers because they are the same Force tradition. The New Erie Sector's capital is the planet Gala, and the ruling authority of the sector is the Beju Tala dynasty. Well, it was. They converted to a standard democratic sector government about a decade before the Trade Federation invasion of Naboo. The monarchy had always maintained its rulership mainly as a way of mediating between the mutually hostile hill people, city people, and sea people, but had gotten so unpopular that all three tribes were willing to try this whole democracy thing instead, and not even the late Republic was going to condone a violent crackdown on democratic protesters, so the monarchy was eventually forced to relent. Some of the aristocrats tried to maintain control by spoiling the election, and that was foiled by some Jedi Knights that the Republic had sent just in case someone tried this exact kind of thing. You may have heard of these two Jedi, Obi-Wan Kenobi and Qui-Gon Jinn. Greetings, my name is Chamomile, and this is an exploration of the entire galaxy sector by sector. Today, we're looking at the Perkel sector in the 12th Cerulean Spear Command. Perkel sector is on the border between the mid and outer rim and is probably most famous for Kenari, that planet Cassian Andor is from. Apparently there was some kind of planet-wide poisoning from a strip mining operation that left only children alive somehow. Our main source on what happened here is Cassian Andor himself, as relayed by people who knew him in the Rebellion, so we aren't exactly dealing with a full account, and he was young enough that even if he was still around to interview, we probably couldn't trust his account too much. The species homeworld of the sector is Muga, however, home to the Mugans. The Mugans were separatists, though they kinda got dragged into it because of their association with the Commerce Guild. They helped the CIS smuggle black market goods into Mandalore past an embargo put in place due to Mandalorian neutrality. And there's not much else going on here. Some skirmishes in the Clone Wars and the Galactic Civil War. There was an outpost of the Antarian Rangers. That's a non-Force using tradition allied with the Jedi, basically people who wanted to be intergalactic do-gooders but didn't have the Force, so they made their own do-gooding organization. Nothing particularly special about their outpost on the planet Tebid, though. It was just one of them. There are two alleged species homeworlds, but the only information on the species living there are the Demonims, both named after the planets they're from. Thodians of planet Thodia and Trancretes of planet Trancret. A lot of Republic sectors are built around the customs and traditions of a species homeworld, but in this case I wouldn't be surprised if these Demonims are used to refer to the inhabitants of the planet, whatever species they are, and have been mistaken for a species when mentioned in text. You know, a Thodian might be a human or a Wookiee or a Celestin. They're just someone from the planet of Thodia, regardless of species. Greetings, my name is Chamomile, and this is an examination of the entire galaxy sector by sector. Today, we're looking at the Roach sector in 12th Cerulean Spear Command. You'd think there'd be more going on in Roach sector, considering it's on the Prolemian trade route between Lantilles and the Tion cluster. That's generally a pretty hot zone for confrontation in both the Tianese War and the Clone War. Plus, this is the part of space where there's usually 8 million spacer tales about secret witch moons and hidden alien homeworlds where the natives have 7 tentacles and 8 butts and played sabacc with Chewbacca this one time. All that's out here is Shantipole, the planet where rebel engineer Query developed the B-Wing in secret, so that's one cool guy, but there weren't like any battles over it or anything. And Roach, a star system whose asteroid belt is so densely colonized with Verpines that it's become their de facto homeworld, since their original homeworld was lost in ancient pre-Republic times. And I do have a policy of mentioning species homeworlds, and this is as close to that as the Verpines have got. There's also rumors of a world called Va'art, home to 50-foot-long centipede dragon monsters that are strong in the Force, may or may not have been sentient, and have carapaces that can deflect blaster bolts and lightsabers. There's the cool spacer tale that sits on the edge of credulity. We found it. Greetings, my name is Chamomile, and this is an exploration of the entire galaxy sector by sector. Today, we're looking at the Talcine sector of 12th Cerulean Spear Command. As part of my rule of including every species homeworld, confirmed or not, planet Dalerax is allegedly home to the near-human Inu. I hope these guys aren't real. Metalorn was the heart of the Foundry of the Confederacy, the main supplier of battle droids to the CIS's Spinwards front during the Clone Wars. In the days of the Old Republic, it was a jungle world, but in the High Republic era, the Techno-Union began heavy mining and industrial production, and by the time of the Late Republic, it was a desolate smog world, utterly unrecognizable, as the lush, tangled planet it had been before. In the years running up to the Clone Wars, its factories were retooled to produce battle droids in massive numbers. Metalorn was one of the Separatist holdouts that tried to resist the Republic-turned-Empire after the surrender of the Separatist capital in the Tion cluster, and was even part of a small cluster of holdouts that also included Cymirth. This holdout put up more of a fight than, for example, the guys over in Megiddo, but Palpatine wasn't shy about finishing off CIS remnants. I'm honestly not sure if the Separatists had any realistic path to victory after early battles like Christophsis stalled their attacks into the Mid-Rim. Greetings, my name is Chamomile, and this is an exploration of the entire galaxy sector by sector. Today, we're looking at Tenuta sector, where the galaxy stores all its extra letters. This is a surprisingly under-researched sector for something on the Prolemian trade route and in the Mid-Rim. Usually when there's basically nothing to talk about, it's because it's some fringe outer rim sector that people rarely visit. Probably the most notable thing about this sector is that Salvara was the deepest down the Prolemian trade route that the CIS got in the Clone Wars, where the clone armies first arrived to halt the droid Blitz. The overextended droids were beaten handily and had to pull way back. Down the Polemian trade route is doing a lot of work in that statement, though. Both droid and clone armies would sneak around the major hyperroutes once the battles along them had stalemated, which is why the CIS got as far as Baraka in the Lantillian sector, and the Republic was besieging Felucia and Ossus at the end of the war. Ord Tidel was captured by the Rebel Alliance in the Mid-Rim Offensive, but they pulled troops from there for more important battlefronts during the Mid-Rim Retreat. The ease with which the rebels knocked over the Imperial garrison on an ordnance depot was a pretty encouraging early sign, but although most Ord planets are still used as munition stockpiles, they aren't nearly as important as they were in the days of Pius Dea, when hyperdrives absolutely crawled across the galaxy, and travel time was measured in months as soon as you stepped off the major routes like the Polemian. Back in the day, Ord Tidel's central position meant it could be used to rapidly resupply troops all across the sector, but with the speed of modern hyperdrives, Salvara can also do that, and so can Lantilles. The Empire still lost all the ordnance stockpiled at Ord Tidel, and that was an embarrassment and an expense, but there's a reason it wasn't guarded super heavily, and that neither side prioritized it during the Mid-Rim Retreat. Ivexia is at least enough of a major world to build these cool-looking mirror spires. They're about half a mile high. That's pretty tall, but, I mean, it's not Coruscant tall, and they're not that densely packed. It's not an Ecumenopolis. They just decided to build a couple of towers really tall and cover them in reflective glass. Partly. Greetings, my name is Chamomile, and this is an exploration of the entire galaxy sector by sector. Today, we're looking at the Vorzid sector of 12th Cerulean Spear Command. The planet from Vorzid sector you've seen is Niamos. This is a tiny resort planet with a population of less than 10 million, but it recently showed up in a popular historical drama shot on location, and it is legitimately a nice tourist destination. I wonder what the Niamos authorities thought about how the planet was portrayed. Did tourism go down because the vibe people left with is that Niamos is the planet where you get unjustly arrested? Like, if you ask them about it, obviously the vast majority of people understand that the Empire is over, and shore troopers don't go around arresting random people for slave labor with a thin fig leaf of plausible deniability. But a lot of marketing is vibes-based, and Niamos does not have a great vibe in this episode. Vorzid sector sits on the border between the Tion cluster, the Republic's oldest stronghold beyond the core and the colonies, and core Sith territory like Yavin, Korriban, and Zeost. In the early Republic, it was a peaceful sector on the fringe of the Tianese War and subsequently far away from the conflicts with the Hutt Empire that defined most of that era. But in the Old Republic era, the Sith Wars brought war to the sector over and over again. The nature of the Sith Empire was that a powerful Sith Emperor would unite the fractious Sith warlords together, attack the Republic, who is both their ancient nemesis and also the only remaining nation to seize territory from once all the Sith Lords were accounted for, and then eventually the ruling imperial dynasty of the Sith would fall. The Sith would descend back into infighting over who would be the new Sith Emperor, and the Republic would recapture all their old territory and send some garrisons over to planets like Zeost so they could pretend they'd wiped out the Sith Empire once and for all by seizing their capital. But of course the Republic wants to demilitarize and enjoy a peace dividend, so that garrison ends up being like 5,000 troops, which is no problem at all for the next Sith Emperor to deal with once they get all the Sith Lords hiding on the fringe worlds hammered back into an empire. And the way in which the Sith Empire would totally disintegrate before reforming over and over again meant that sectors like Vorzid, which were on the flank of their core territory, would not be ruled long-term by either side, but would instead be battlefronts in every single war. Naga Sadow conquers Vorzid and loses it. Exar Kun conquers Vorzid and loses it. Darth Revan conquers Vorzid and loses it. Vitiate conquers Vorzid, loses it to another different empire also run by Vitiate, then loses it to the Republic, and so on. At one point, late into the Old Republic era, a sympathetic Jedi helps the planet Aura Terra erase itself from star charts and become a self-sufficient, single-planet state with no external communication so that it can escape all the wars. This part of the galaxy has been fully explored by millennia at this point, so no one was double-checking whether or not any of the millions of uninhabited worlds in this sector, as there are in every sector, has been miscategorized. The Jedi kept track of the world, though, which meant that when the Empire seized the Jedi Library, they found out about it. There wasn't some terrible invasion or anything, but Aura Terra was reintegrated into galactic society against their will. The major world and sector capital is Colomex, along the Polemian trade route. Colomex was a Tianese planet at the furthest reach of the Tian hegemony under Zim. Like the Gristmouth dynasty over in Meridian sector, the Tianese aristocrats of Colomex did not rejoin the rest of the Tian hegemony when it reconstituted itself after Zim's death. Instead, Colomux formed the Commonality in the Vorzid cluster. The Commonality is basically a colonial democratic sector in that it runs a lot like the Republic in miniature, with a ruling Senate who elects a supreme executive from amongst their number and so forth, but there are some differences because they aren't an actual colonial democratic sector. They were an independent nation that copied the Republic in some ways, but not others, and then joined as a sector, retaining, as lots of sectors did, their local governing traditions. Funny enough, records insist that the Commonality was a coalition of 5 sectors, but every single member species, of which there are quite a few, is from Vorzid sectors, so I think the Vorzid Commonality had 5 sectors in it, but joined the Republic as a single sector. The only thoroughly confirmed member species with a homeworld in the Vorzid cluster's commonality is the Anomids, who have a mask-wearing tradition. These aren't breath masks. The Anomids breathe the same oxygen-rich atmosphere that most carbon-based animals do, but an Anomid's status and relation in their society are reflected in their mask, and going outside without your mask is like going out without your pants is for most species. Like, you can, it's physically possible, but you're not going to do it accidentally. There are 2 other verified member species in the commonality, though, that being humans, naturally, and the Solonians, ferret-like humanoids, who, according to artists on the internet, are either gritty badasses or low-key furbait. We'll talk more about them when we get to their homeworld in the Cerulean sector. The other member species of the commonality are not verified, and there's 4 of them while we only have room for 2 more. 5 total, counting humans, Solonians, and Anomids, if each one was meant to have its own sector in the commonality before it joined the Republic as a single sector. That's me guessing, but these are all unverified, so it wouldn't be too surprising if one of them turned out to be entirely made up. And for that matter, either humans, Solonians, or both might not have had their own sector within the Vorzid commonality, depending on how big and important their colonial population was. Details are fuzzy, and there's lots of plausible ways this might have worked before the Empire came along and crushed it all into a regular sector ruled by a moth. Our 4 candidates are the Herakians, frontrunners for being made up because these guys are just humans with particularly bushy eyebrows. The Kilmalsi are cool bird people with a strong martial tradition. The Pygoon, who might be a moon colony misunderstood as a species homeworld, they have a reputation for being mathematicians and engineers. And the Vorzidiak of Vorzid 4 and Vorzid 5, an industrious species who experience a sense of restless uselessness and existential dread really rapidly, to the point where they kind of hate having days off. These are all kind of twee descriptions that reduce a species down to just one job, of the sort that you tend to get when someone needs to boil down an entire planet to one sentence. They're not wrong, provided you understand that they are vastly oversimplified. You know, the Pygoon, if they aren't just moon anyway, might have like 10% more mechanic and engineer jobs than other planets, but for the most part, they are guys in hoodies just like everyone else. But also, these oversimplified descriptions are easy to make up for Spacer Tales. There's not a lot of information on the type of government used by the commonality, and given the Republican miniature design, it might be that each of the 5 member sectors have different governments and legal codes. That wouldn't be any more convoluted than the Republic already is. But I do find it interesting that they are called the Commonality. It seems like they have a real focus on being a local alliance amongst equals. Greetings, my name is Chamomile, and this is an exploration of the entire galaxy sector by sector. Today, we're talking about the Cronies Mandate in 12th Cerulean Spear Command. The Cronies Mandate mostly overlaps with the old pre-Republic nation of the Kron Kingdom, although a handful of planets have been bitten off and given to the nearby allied Tion sector. The Kron Kingdom was the dominant power of the Tion cluster in the early Republic days, if you even count it as the Republic yet. The core worlds were clearly Republic-esque, but the official founding date is a couple of decades after the conquest of the Kron Kingdom, at the hands of the pirate king Zer, whose son Zim the Despot would go on to conquer the entire Tion cluster and then some, thus forming the Tion hegemony. Zer was a Tianese aristocrat who turned to piracy, for what reason isn't clear, and became so successful that he became head of a pirate alliance with enough captains answering to his flag and treasure in his holds that he captured the remote planet of Argai and then spent 10 years biting off chunks of the Kron Kingdom. The Tion cluster was densely populated even then, so Zer's advance into the Kron Kingdom was done one noble at a time, and those nobles controlled not entire planets, but only small fractions of them. After a decade of nibbling at the Kron Kingdom one castle at a time, Zaire had only conquered 4 planets, his native Argai, plus Dravion, Corlas, and Panna. This was a phenomenal amount of success for a pirate, and yet also seemed pretty insignificant in the face of the Kron Kingdom, which ruled over a dozen major worlds with hundreds of millions, if not billions, of inhabitants each. The Kronese king tried to buy Zaire off with fantastic riches, and that clued Zaire in that the Kron Kingdom didn't necessarily expect to win a fight with Zaire. That was kind of surprising. Zaire ruled 4 planets, and the Kron Kingdom was the dominant power of the cluster at the time. Well, Zaire took that bet, storming through the Kron Kingdom and capturing its capital of Chandar. Chandar was one of the 4 thrones of Kron, recognized as the major powers of the Tian cluster, and having defeated the dominant power of the Tian cluster, Zaire proceeded to roll through 2 of the other thrones, and Cadenth, one of the 3 allied kingdoms of what would eventually become the allied Tian sector, and Raxus at the end of the Andrexu spiral of what would eventually become the reduced Tian hegemony of the modern galaxy, which is less commonly but more helpfully known as the Kalula sector. Zaire also tried to capture Desevro, the 4th throne, capital of the Livian League, but was never able to defeat them before being succeeded by his son, the legendary Zim the Despot, who would complete the conquest of the Tian cluster by defeating Desevro and expanding his empire out to a total of 8 thrones, or 9 if you count Slaheron, the planet that Zim had picked out to be his 9th throne on the northern fringe of Hutt space, but he was either killed or captured while fighting the Hutts for it. Records vary. After Zim's death, his empire tore itself apart, but fairly quickly reconstituted itself into the Tian hegemony, with power shared mostly equally between the aristocratic traditions of the core 4 thrones of Kron, but with Raxus exchanged for Zaire and Zim's homeworld of Argai. The outer 4 thrones added by Zim shared some amount of influence as well, although these would not be core Tianese territory. The Hutts would pillage the 7th and 8th thrones in the Kyrium Reach pretty freely, and after the arrival of the Republic in the region, the Hutts would torch the Kyrium Reach completely, including both of its throne worlds, to create a desolate buffer zone between themselves and the potential Republic-Tian alliance, creating the region that is now known as the Ash Worlds. Despite the Hutts' fears, the Tian hegemony was initially hostile to the Republic, which was hemming them in from potential expansion by blazing down the Prolemian trade route, bumping up against the 6th throne in the Thanium worlds. The Tianese War went well for the Republic, but not so well that the Tian hegemony wasn't able to negotiate some pretty generous terms of surrender and incorporation into the Republic as a sector. This was the first time the Republic had a significant expansion outside the core worlds. The Cerulean run hadn't even been blazed out to the Outer Rim at this time, and the Republic had yet to encounter the Arcanus Regency or the monarchies of Naboo or Iriadu, let alone incorporate them as sectors. Just as the Hutts feared, the union between the Republic and the Tian hegemony strengthened opposition to their dominance in the Outer Rim, and this outcome was even worse than the Hutts thought. The result of the Tianese War made it clear that the Republic's heartlands in the galactic core were even more prosperous and powerful than the densely packed worlds of the Tian cluster. By the time of the Clone Wars, the Tian cluster was mostly ruined. Millennia of economic exploitation had turned worlds like Chandar and Aramax into polluted city planets that had once held hundreds of billions of inhabitants until the growing environmental devastation of worlds like Ur-7 and Raxus Prime made it impossible to import enough food, and emigration and a bit of starvation thinned their populations down to what the enervated sector could support. The Tian aristocracy was deeply in bed with the Outer Rim corporations whose exploitations had wrecked most of their planets, and still considered themselves a galactic power on par with Coruscant and Alsaken and the other core worlds of the Republic. To the Tianese, the Republic had been a long and profitable union between the core and the Tian cluster, but one that was now reaching its end as the Republic sought to rein in the exploitation of the Outer Rim by corporations like the Trade Federation, Techno Union, and the Banking Clan. While the Tian cluster was by no means spared from the environmental consequences of this exploitation, they'd also profited from it, especially the aristocrats who could afford estates insulated from the damage on places like Raxus Secundus. The last thing they wanted was to have that income cut off by strict regulations on the exploitation of the rest of the Outer Rim, while still being left to clean up the aftermath of thousands of years of mining and manufacturing in the Tian cluster. The Tian cluster became the capital of the Confederacy of Independent Systems. It was mostly unscathed by the Clone Wars. The Republic's Outer Rim sieges never got past planets like Ossus, Felucia, and Belderone, near but not actually in the Tian cluster. You'd think there'd be more to say about the Clone Wars in a region so dense with history, especially since it was the capital of one of the two sides, but the Tian cluster surrendered to the Republic before their perimeter was breached. They saw other separatist strongholds like Megiddo and Siskiyne fall and decided they did not particularly want to be orbitally bombarded into submission, so they gave up without a fight. In order to weaken the Tian cluster and hopefully prevent them from rising up against the core again, the sector was split into multiple other sectors, mostly allied Tian, the Kranes Mandate, and a new reduced Tian hegemony, now called the Kalula sector. Even split three ways, there are too many major worlds to describe in just the Kranes Mandate. The Tian cluster's attempt to be the core of the Rim went really poorly, but it's easy to see why they thought they could pull it off. Arcan 4 is a massive trade center, Kismano is somehow still not completely mined out despite continuous operations since before the time of Zer VIII, Pasmin is still a major textile manufacturing center, Nuswata is still home to the legendary Forbidden Gardens built by the Hierophants of the High Fane of Zo. Although the gardens have seen better days, the planet of Corvus has relatively recently begun intensive mining operations during the Imperial era, and with the decline of many other worlds in the region, Abon is considered the most economically and militarily powerful planet of the Kranes Mandate as of the Clone Wars and, to a lesser extent, still today. The fate of all the Kranes Mandate planets is pretty well tied together, and the story of one is the story of the others, but there are a lot of them. The Empire split the Tian hegemony into like 5 sectors, but if they stuck to one major world per sector, they could have made at least 30. Naturally, all of the sectors of the former Tian hegemony greatly resented the Galactic Empire. When the near-Ishbai Calamari space openly rebelled against the Empire after the destruction of the first Death Star, the Tian cluster sectors became a major hotbed of rebel activity. The Empire's efforts to crush the rebellions in Tian were more successful than in Calamari space, but the cluster remained a major thorn in their side for the entire duration of the Galactic Civil War. After Jakku, the Tian cluster got passed around a couple of different Imperial remnants, but none of them could hold on to it, and after decades of struggle against the core, they finally broke free and became independent systems. Today, the Tian cluster is still split between the Kranes Mandate, Allied Tian, and the Tian hegemony, as the 3 newly independent governments can't agree on which one of them is the rightful successor of the mandate of the old Tian hegemony, and which ones would be subordinate. So, now they're semi-officially the 3 thrones of Tian. Greetings, my name is Chamomile and this is an exploration of the entire galaxy sector by sector. Today, we're talking about the Allied Tian sector. The Tian hegemony was one of the first sectors outside of the core to be incorporated into the Republic, and it was the Republic's first victory against the Hutt Empire, although an indirect one. Then in the Clone Wars, the Tian hegemony was the capital sector of the CIS. The victorious Empire split the hegemony into a half-dozen sectors to weaken them, and Allied Tian was one of the sectors made from that split. Allied Tian sort of corresponds to the old 3 allied kingdoms of Jamanir, Cadenth, and Barseg that served as a buffer state between the Kron Kingdom and the Livian League, but this is pretty far in the weeds of history even for people born and raised in the Tian cluster. Like, everyone from the Tian cluster knows about Zim the Despot, but even in Tian, the only people who know about the 3 allied kingdoms are the kinds of people who watch pop education vids on the HoloNet, you nerds. The people of the Tian cluster still mostly think of themselves as a single united sector, but their new sector governments don't agree on which one of them should be the sector's central government in the New Republic, so they remain split. Allied Tian doesn't even match up completely to the old allied kingdoms, so don't be surprised if some planets from the Kingdom of Kron show up. Like, Amarin is an old hunting reserve that was originally part of the Kingdom of Kron before Zim conquered it for his empire, which eventually became the Tian hegemony after Zim died and they had to figure out what their identity was going to be now that they were no longer the personal project of one man who was really good at conquering planets. Being the cradle of one of the most ancient galactic civilizations, the whole Tian cluster has a huge number of major worlds, to the point where it's hard to know which ones to bother mentioning. It feels weird to completely ignore planets with hundreds of millions or billions of inhabitants, but also these planets were packed so close to one another that the history of one is mostly also the history of the others. Things that happened on one planet also affected the rest, so... Lightning round. Dersagor is a mountainous mining planet. Dravion is one of the first worlds conquered by Zim the Despot, an agri-world that's mostly unimportant except for the Zim-era archaeology facilitated by the well-preserved ruins of ancient arrays built there and preserved since the pre- to early Republic era due to the low temperatures and thin air of the mountain peaks. Emberil has a mild climate similar to Naboo and is almost completely covered in aristocratic estates, some of which date back to the era of Zim. Jantoria is where the Livian League fought Zim. They lost. They make real good wine. Spinax 3 is a water world home to an ancient tradition of Leviathan hunting, but heavy pollution of the oceans killed the last of the Leviathans during the High Republic period, and now it's basically just a giant ball of toxic sludge. According to legend, the Gormak used to be the only species on the planet of Voss when the Sith Empire found and subjugated it. The Jedi drove the Sith off and taught several of the Gormak the ways of the Force so they could defend themselves in the future, and apparently this was so taxing on the Gormak that it rapidly evolved them into a new Voss species over the course of just a few generations. Evolution doesn't work that way, so I'm skeptical, but certainly by the time of the Galactic Cold War many centuries later, the planet had two distinct species on it, the more material Gormak and the more mystical Voss. The conflict became a proxy war, with the Sith supporting the Gormak and the Republic supporting the Voss, but the conflict was eventually resolved peacefully when both sides found a common enemy in the Eternal Empire. I remain skeptical of a lot of the details of the Eternal Empire, and I don't think their presence here is even necessary to explain the resolution of the Gormak-Voss conflict. Most wars have a negotiated end after both sides fight each other to exhaustion, with the side who got the worst of the fighting being forced to make more concessions but not being subjugated completely. Anyway, the only part of the Eternal Fleet that's hard to believe is that the origins of their fleet are allegedly from a slightly different Starforge made by an unrelated ancient lost civilization from the ones who made the actual Starforge, and none of those details have any impact on their ability to have a fleet at all, or to use that fleet to attack Voss, thus uniting the two species and putting an end to their conflict. Corlax 4 is a middlingly important industrial planet that joined the CIS with Barseg. According to rumor, then-Chancellor Palpatine ordered Jedi Master Darius Jet to destroy the planet's industrial capacity, something which would wipe out most of the planet's hundreds of millions of inhabitants in the process. Darius Jet ultimately refused to carry out the plan. This seems pretty fishy to me, though. Like, in the first few weeks of the Clone Wars, Palpatine is already trying to carry out planetary genocides, and he decides to entrust this massive escalation of violent authoritarianism to a Jedi Master? The plan did fail, so maybe Palpatine massively overestimated the galaxy's appetite for destruction in the early stages of the Clone Wars. But I find it hard to believe that Palpatine was that inept a manipulator all the way back at the dawn of the Clone Wars. It would take several years of vicious warfare for the core worlds to work up an appetite for the kind of carnage that the Republic engaged in at around the time it was reorganized into the Empire, and it sure seems like Palpatine always knew that would be the case, seeing as how he engineered an entire multi-year war rather than a short-lived crisis like the invasion of Naboo had been. He knew that something short wouldn't work up that kind of bloodlust in the core worlds. Barseg was the capital of the Kingdom of Barseg, which continued to exist on paper up until the High Republic era. The Tian hegemony was nominally a feudal empire and successor state to Zim the Despot, but Zim didn't really leave any instructions for how to appoint a successor before he got himself killed or maybe enslaved or otherwise neutralized while fighting the Hutts. So despite nominally being a hegemony ruled by a hegemon, the Tian hegemony was an ugly compromise between a bunch of different aristocratic traditions who had been jammed together by the conquest of Zim and didn't want to disintegrate and present an easy target to the Ascendant Hutts. When this ball of border gore held together by twine encountered the early Republic, they fought a war and the Republic won, but the Republic didn't land armies in all the throne worlds and subjugate the Tian hegemony. The Tian hegemony got the worst of it and realized that if they tried to fight the Republic, they would end up sliced up between the Republic and the Hutt Empire, and decided to surrender to the Republic while they still had some negotiating power. That resulted in a negotiated surrender, but because the Tian hegemony had the wisdom to negotiate and the early Republic was much less committed to requiring democracy from prospective new sectors compared to the old and especially High Republic, the Tian hegemony was able to grandfather in all kinds of aristocratic bullshit when they joined the Republic as a sector. And that included the Kingdom of Barseg, one of the Tian hegemony's member states, ruling over planets like Liana and Lorad as feudal properties. Lorad in particular was, despite being a major world with lots of major urban population centers, technically not a member world of the Republic, but instead a subjugated vassal of a Republic sector. And that lasted clear into the High Republic era, when the Republic finally decided to clean that up. Barseg's rigid caste system persisted on cultural momentum despite the democratic reforms of the High Republic and the economic reforms of the Late Republic. Of all the aristocratic traditions bound together in the Tian hegemony, Barseg was always the one who hated the Republic the most, proud of their imperial past and resentful of the reforms imposed upon their rigidly authoritarian society by Republic idealists. So, unsurprisingly, Barseg was a strong supporter of the CIS. They were relatively untouched by the Clone Wars since they were within the perimeter that the CIS capital in Tian was able to maintain even during the Outer Rim sieges behind planets like Felucia, Colomex, and Ossus. and they surrender rather than fight to the death like CIS holdouts on planets like Megiddo or Siskine. Barseg and the rest of the Tion cluster weren't spared the wrath of the Empire in the aftermath, though. The expense of rebuilding the economy was foisted onto separatist worlds as much as possible, especially the Tion cluster, who still had a powerful economy to loot. Liana is a major trade world along the Prelemian trade route, one whose economic power quickly eclipsed that of their old feudal lords on Barseg during the Late Republic era. This made Liana a strong supporter of the Galactic Republic during the Clone Wars, which went extraordinarily poorly for them, seeing as they were in the heart of separatist territory. Liana's wealth meant they had a pretty powerful planetary defense force, but not so powerful that they could stand up to a galactic power like the Confederacy of Independent Systems. The whole planet was left in ruins, and when the Empire ransacked the Tion cluster to fund reconstruction, the priority was in repairing core worlds whose economies had burnt out from the manic war production required to keep up with the CIS, leaving Republic loyalists in the Outer Rim like Liana mostly to fend for themselves. Luckily for Liana, they were still located on the Prelemian trade route, so they were able to make enough money to fund their own reconstruction, and wound up a major producer of TIE fighters in the Imperial era. The Allied Tion sector is mostly the territory of the old allied kingdoms of the Tion cluster, Barseg, Jamanir, and Cadenth, who allied with one another in an attempt to stave off domination by the Kron kingdom, the dominant power in the Tion cluster at the time, and later Zim the Despot, who took over the Kron kingdom. The allied kingdoms did pretty good against the Kronese and got shellacked by Zim. Cadenth was the official fourth throne of Zim, the provincial capital of the former territories of the three allied kingdoms under the Tion hegemony, and the de jure capital of the allied Tion sector, although Liana quickly came to overshadow it economically. Cadenth declared neutrality in the Clone Wars, and the Empire mostly ignored them afterwards, but they did pointedly not make them the capital of the allied Tion sector, since they were trying to dismantle the Tion hegemony, whose ancient traditions were rooted in being the first four of the 8 thrones of Zim. Instead, the Empire gave the capital to Jamanir, the last of the 3 allied kingdoms of the pre-Zim era, and the capital of the Jamanir March. The Jamanir March was a short-lived state formed when Jamanir tried to break away from the Tion hegemony after Zim's death. They successfully captured the territory of their old allies in Cadenth and Barseg and held onto it for several years, but ultimately the Jamanir March, as it was called, was just a temporary convulsion of the Tion cluster after Zim's death, and Jamanir's position in the hegemony's border gore wasn't particularly more prominent than that of Cadenth or Barseg. Jamanir might have defeated the official 4th throne of Zim, but the other 7 thrones liked the idea that being a throne of Zim granted legitimacy in the Tion hegemony, and didn't like the idea that a sufficiently gutsy planet could replace a throne by pure force of arms. The Empire tried to revive the Jamanir March because of its combination of being nearly as old as the thrones of Zim, a few decades isn't much of a difference to events from thousands of years ago, and its being explicitly opposed to the aristocratic order of the Tion hegemony, which bases itself in the throne worlds of Zim the Despot. Under the Tion hegemony, Cadenth is the 3rd throne and Jamanir is just another planet, but under the Jamanir March and subsequently under the Galactic Empire, Jamanir is the capital. The Empire liked to encourage these ancient fractious divisions, especially within the Tion hegemony. And just like the aristocrats of Zim's thrones held the Tion hegemony together after his death because being thrones had given them power for 20 years and none of them were particularly excited about giving it up, the sector government of the allied Tion sector wasn't interested in giving up power after the fall of the Empire. There's no record of exactly what happened afterwards, which, for events this recent, that usually means there was a lot of violence and it wasn't particularly well organized. The Tion hegemony remains fractured, and allied Tion in particular remains capitalized out of Jamanir, specifically because that spits in the face of the 4 thrones of the old Tion hegemony. Greetings, my name is Chamomile, and this is an exploration of the entire galaxy sector by sector. Today, we're talking about Keldrath sector in the 12th Cerulean Spear Command. Keldrath sector is home to Gibu, homeworld of the Vibugri, a species of large insectoid aliens. And that's pretty much it for this sector. It's one of the sectors split off from the Tion hegemony at the end of the Clone Wars, but it's on the fringe of the old hegemony and doesn't include any of the worlds that part of the galaxy is famous for. Not every sector has a story. Greetings, my name is Chamomile, and this is an examination of the entire galaxy sector by sector. Today, we're looking at the Ash Worlds. The Ash Worlds were the furthest extent of the empire of Zim the Despot, who united the Tion cluster under his iron fist and then pushed the Tionese border far beyond their home cluster. The Ash Worlds were known to the Tian hegemony as the Kyrium Reaches, and were the source of the valuable ore Kyrium, used by the Tianese for armor ranging from infantry carapace to war droid plating, all the way up to starship hulls. These days, it sits at an unfortunate crossroads of being fairly rare and also not very good compared to modern Durasteel, and it's kind of weird reading records from the era and people are just going nuts for all the Kyrium coming out of the sector. Lord Zim, you'll never believe the extraordinary mountains of garbage we have pulled out of this planet. It was very good ore for the time, though. The Kyrium Reaches are where the Tian hegemony bordered the Hutt Empire, and they did not do well there. It is from here that Zim marshaled his forces to confront the Hutt Empire at Vontor, where he was repeatedly defeated and, so the stories go, betrayed and captured. Zim's two throne worlds in this sector were Astagone and Huranam, and like all Zim's throne worlds, they were lush, beautiful, and prosperous worlds. Their location on the border between the Hutt Empire and the Tian hegemony meant that they were subject to constant Hutt raiding, however. When the Tian hegemony began discussions of alliance with the early Republic against the Hutt Empire, discussions that would eventually break down and result in the Tianese War, but the Hutts didn't know that at the time, so they laid waste to the whole region in order to create a desolate buffer zone that could not be used as a staging ground for a potential Tian Republic coalition fleet. The devastation was so thorough that it's only in the last couple of years that an academic consensus has emerged for exactly which planets Astagone and Huranam actually were, and Astagone in particular was reduced to a barren rock. It's still got a breathable atmosphere, but with no arable land, it's about the last place you'd want to put a colony. People suggested that Colomux and even Lantilles might have been the secret identity of Astagone and Huranam, but that never made much sense because why would Zim use planets all the way over here for staging an attack on Hutt space over here? But if you see towns or resorts called Astagone in the middle of the Mid-Rim, that's why. Huranam is still an inhabitable planet, but its population was totally wiped out and its environment massively altered by the Hutt genocide. It's now called Windigal II, and the colonists there had no idea of the historical significance of the disease-ridden swamp world they were trying to set up shop on, nor that most of the diseases it is ridden with were artificially engineered by Hutt psychopaths. The New Republic looked at this desolate wasteland brought about by an ancient genocide and said, yeah, this is the perfect place to put New Alderaan. Okay, in fairness, it wasn't the New Republic. The Rebel Alliance established a secret colony for Alderanians who had been off-world when the Death Star destroyed the planet, in order to preserve Alderanian culture, and they were doing it in the immediate aftermath of Alderaan's destruction, so they were limited to Outer Rim planets that were remote enough to be defended by nearby rebels in case the Empire decided they needed to make a point of finishing the job. New Alderaan isn't a terrible planet to live on, given those constraints, but unsurprisingly, most surviving Alderanians moved to Kamas or Coruscant in the years after the New Republic was established. The Ash Worlds are also home to the planet Iago, secluded in a nebula that provides warmth and light without any nearby star. The lack of a nearby star means that Iago got skipped over by galactic explorers for millennia. Iago is called the Planet of 1,000 Moons. I don't know how literal that is, and probably it's 50 moons tops, because 1,000 moons sounds pretty impossible gravitationally, but they've definitely got a ton of moons. Iago is home to the Diathim, a species called angels by spacers because spacers love their stories of Outer Rim angels. Most of the stories told about so-called angels are not at all true of the Diathim specifically, but the Diathim are at least a real species. The CIS stumbled across Iago during the Clone Wars and deployed forces there, but none of them ever came back. I doubt the planet is literally haunted, but clearly there's some unexplained phenomena going on there that make it pretty hard to come and go like it was a regular planet. And we're in the Outer Rim, so here's the prerequisite list of 18 million allegedlys. Allegedly, there is a three-headed alien species called the Nini, native to the Ash Worlds. Allegedly, there is a species of star dragons called Duinaguin, who live reclusive lives in the Outer Rim and go to the Ash World of Zaquaris to die. Allegedly, there is a planet in the Ash Worlds called Chiron, which is inhabited by Centauriforms, one of whom became a Jedi in Luke's Jedi Order and was presumably killed by Kylo Ren at some point. Sounds made up, but I can't find an exhaustive list of all Jedi trained by Luke, so I can't prove it. Hashemut is allegedly the site of an ancient Jedi stronghold from which the Jedi Order, then based on nearby Ossus, kept watch over the Tion cluster. Allegedly, there is a desert planet in the Ash Worlds called Bis, no not that one, and it is home to the Abyssin species, violent, cannibalistic space trolls who regenerate rapidly. The Abyssin are definitely a real species and are favored by the Hutts as slave warriors, but I have no idea if their homeworld is actually in the Ash Worlds, since the Hutts established a breeding population of them in Hutt space ages ago. Admittedly, maybe this is just me hoping against hope that there aren't two different planets called Bis that are completely unrelated, because that would be really annoying. Greetings, my name is Chamomile, and this is an examination of the entire galaxy sector by sector. Today, we're talking about the Indrexu sector in 12th Cerulean Spear Command. When the CIS capital sector, the Tion hegemony, surrendered to the Republic-turned-Empire, they were split into multiple sectors to weaken them politically, dividing the sector government a half-dozen ways in hopes that none of them would be able to agree on who was the proper successor to the old Tion hegemony, which would make it harder for them to plot future rebellion. It worked. 30 years later, when the Imperial remnants were collapsing throughout the 12th Cerulean Spear region of the galaxy, the Tion hegemony could have reunited into a single sector or a unified independent government, but they didn't. No one could agree on which sector governor would lead a newly reunified Tion hegemony. Everyone agreed it wouldn't be the Indrexu sector, though. The Indrexu sector is formed out of the old territory of the Indrexu Coalition, a nation that existed for like 5 minutes after the death of Zim the Despot, the conqueror who first nailed the Tion cluster together. After uniting the Cronies world, the Tion cluster, Zim the Despot expanded his empire in all directions, most famously into regions like the Thanium worlds, the Kyrium reaches, and the legendary Queendom of Ranroon. Far Indrexu, as the region was known under Zim's reign, was basically just a couple of spare planets he nabbed to fill in the gaps between the Tion cluster and the Queendom of Ranroon in order to avoid any indefensible salient in his realm. After Zim's death, the Tion hegemony briefly split, but the Indrexu coalition fell in line with the Throne Worlds when they established the Tion hegemony as a successor to Zim's empire. The coalition was, as the name implies, an alliance of planetary governments with no single capital, so the official sector capital of Astaria was chosen because they're the sector's biggest starport, located along the Prolemian trade route, near the very rim of the galaxy. Astaria is not even that densely populated of a planet. The Tion hegemony tried to be the core worlds of the Outer Rim, and you can see why they thought they could pull it off when you look at how many major worlds there are in sectors like the Cronies Mandate and Allied Tion, but Indrexu sector is pretty sparsely populated even by general galactic standards, let alone the standard set by the Tion cluster. There is one species homeworld here, Shalivane, home of the Emlee, and if the Republic had still been the Republic when the Tion hegemony was being split up, Indrexu sector probably would have been made their domain the same way a lot of other species homeworlds are sector capitals. As it is, the Emlee were conquered by Zim and then, a few generations later, joined the Republic as part of the Tion hegemony. The Emlee were and are a warrior culture who won the respect of Zim despite how easily he rolled over them, operating as Zim was with most of the resources of the Tion cluster backing him up against just one planet. It wasn't exactly a fair fight. The Emlee led an uprising against the Galactic Empire after the destruction of the Death Star, drawing in human allies from across minor worlds in the sector like Endergad and Ankh-Klishor. Indrexu sector rebelled alongside other Outer Rim aliens nearby like the Mon Calamari and the Dornians, but unlike Calamari Space and the Dominus sector, the Indrexu sector is right on the Prolemian trade route, and the Empire had no trouble launching the entirety of 12th Cerulean Spear straight down the hyperroute to crush the rebellion. The capital city of Shalivane, Kinshasa, was reduced to rubble by the Imperial counterattack, and all the rebel worlds in Indrexu sector were resubjugated. This didn't deter the rebels from the mid-rim offensive, but in retrospect, it probably should have. Greetings, my name is Chamomile, and this is an exploration of the entire galaxy sector by sector. Today, we're talking about the User sector. There is allegedly a planet called Zuliria in User sector, which is home to the Zulirians. That is all the information anyone on the entire holonet has on them. I'm really starting to question my rule of including every supposed species homeworld in these videos. The User sector is along the Prolemian trade route and formed the border of Republic space and the territory held by the Tion hegemony at the time of the Tianese War, when the hegemony was officially called the Honorable Union of Tion and Desevro, and also there was some other border gore going on that we're not going to get into. The reason why Maldrude sector, just down the Prolemian trade route, gets so many resorts and shopping centers and other touristy, hey, look how cool we are places calling themselves Huronam and Astagone, after the two lost throne worlds of Zim, is because Maldrude was the Tion side of that border, and people had a tendency to think of Tion's border with the Republic as the furthest extent of their empire, although In retrospect, it makes much more sense that Zim's lost thrones were on the border with the Hutt Empire, his primary rival, not the Republic, which didn't even formally exist during Zim's reign and was considered a distant upstart, no more important than the Arcanis Regency at the time of the Tianese War. The Republic and the Tian hegemony both recognized that they should combine their might to oppose the Hutt Empire, the dominant power of the Outer Rim, and the most powerful polity in the galaxy at the time, although bear in mind the galaxy was split between 100 nations back then, so that doesn't mean they were in control of anywhere near half the galactic population or anything. Regardless, the Republic made diplomatic overtures, but Tian viewed the Republic as a nation of grocers, rank amateurs at war, and thought they could subjugate the Republic easily and turn their industry and population against the Hutt Empire by force, without the need to make any compromises with the mostly democratic core worlds. Anyone who studied any part of history, whether or not they studied the Tian cluster specifically, can tell you how this song and dance ends. It turns out that you don't need to be educated from birth in the art of war to figure out how to dig a trench and stay in it when the enemy starts shelling you, which is the main skill required of soldiers in a war. All it takes is guts, and while the first 3 to 6 months of combat experience makes a hell of a difference to how much guts you've got, after that, you've either got it or you don't, regardless of whether you are a landed aristocrat hunting in the wilds of Amarin or a grocery bagger on Lantilles. After a few years to get that crucial initial experience all through their armed forces, the Republic was every bit as hard-bitten as the Tian hegemony, and now the Tianese were starting to learn that your military traditions don't really count for shit when the enemy still has artillery shells, and you don't. User Sector bore the brunt of the initial Tianese invasion, and got hit hard in those early years when Republic soldiers were building up veterancy. Okator 8 was famously torched, but planets like Cortilia Major and Uthtara were also in the line of fire. The damage wasn't as extensive as the kind of ruin that the Sith, Hutts, and Galactic Empire got famous for. Buildings were destroyed, but there was no long-lasting environmental damage. Okator 8 was always kind of a shitty marginal world, so, there wasn't a whole lot to ruin in the first place, if we're being honest. The Tian cluster ultimately lost that war, but lost narrowly enough that they were able to enter the Republic under a negotiated surrender that made them easily the single most powerful sector in the Republic, all the way through to the Clone Wars. They learned the lesson of the Tianese War super hard, converting throughout the time of the Republic from an agrarian, traditionally feudal aristocracy to a heavily industrialized, neo-feudal corporate aristocracy. And that meant that when the Clone Wars rolled around and the Tian cluster became the capital of the Confederacy of Independent Systems, the Tianese were way better at invading the Republic this time around. User Sector was completely overrun, and the CIS were halfway to Coruscant by the time the Clone Army intercepted them in the Lantillian sector and started pushing them back up the Prolemian trade route. If the Republic didn't have a secret clone army, the CIS could plausibly have stormed the core before its legendary industry could retool itself to make tanks and warships. The Republic did have a clone army, though, and the CIS forces overextended with the expectation that they would only be facing underprepared planetary defense forces, lost pretty much all the ground that they took about as quickly as they took it. Greetings, my name is Chamomile, and this is an exploration of the entire galaxy sector by sector. Today, we're looking at the Kalula sector in 12th Cerulean Spear Command. You'll see this sector get called the Tian Hegemony on most maps, and that is the official name and generally the preferred name of people who live there. But I'm going with Kalula sector as much as possible because the Tian Hegemony is also the name of an old sector that was the capital sector of the Confederacy of Independent Systems, and which the Republic turned Empire dismembered into 6 to prevent them from consolidating enough power for future uprisings. This part of the Tian cluster was mostly made up of the Livian League and the Back Spiral, 2 areas that didn't really have anything to do with each other in the primordial pre-Republic days before Zim the Despot united the cluster. Decevro and Raxus were 2 of the 4 thrones of Kron. Raxus is the most politically significant of the 4 thrones, and no other sector gets 2 thrones instead of 4. This is kind of baffling. Dividing the Tian hegemony was supposed to prevent them from consolidating by encouraging different sector governments to bicker over which one of them were the true successors of the old government, the ones who would lead a reunified Tian hegemony. But the answer to that question pretty clearly seems to be the Kalula sector. Their official name is the Tian Hegemony, same as the old unified sector was named, and they rule a greater share of the 4 thrones than any other sector. I guess the plan was to make the other Tianese sectors envy and resent Kalula? Greetings, my name is Chamomile, and this is an exploration of the entire galaxy sector by sector. Today, we're talking about the Auril sector of 12th Cerulean Spear Command. Auril sector has the dubious honor of being home to Baldemnik, a cortosis-rich planet that's significant mainly because it is supposedly the site where Darth Tenebris was killed by his Sith apprentice Darth Plagueis, who was himself supposedly the Sith teacher to Darth Sidious, also known as Sheev Palpatine. This, of course, assumes you believe the whole Sith conspiracy thing at all. Sheev Palpatine was definitely a Sith, but it's less certain whether he was part of an unbroken Sith tradition dating back to the Ruusan Reformation, which survived in secret, or if he just dug up a bunch of lost Sith secrets archaeologically. Regardless of who exactly killed who here, Baldemnik's cortosis resources made it important to the CIS for its ability to resist lightsabers. Rhapea is a planet home to the Crimson Aces, a mercenary fighter squadron from the Galactic Civil War. Rhapea had been the primary world of Auril sector since the Exar Kun War, which removed Ossus from the running, we'll get to Ossus in a bit, and the Crimson Aces were the planetary defense force for Rhapea. By the time of the Late Republic, Rhapea had been outpaced by Mercana, a major stronghold of the Corporate Alliance, which had been made sector capital over Rhapea after the blockade of Naboo, in an effort to placate Outer Rim corporations before they escalated any further. It didn't work, and Mercana was the site of one of the Outer Rim sieges. After Mercana was shattered and the Corporate Alliance forces there were crushed, Rhapea became the sector capital again, and the Crimson Aces, who had been neutral in the Clone Wars, became the sector's primary defense force once more. When the Empire was consolidating sector forces into the Imperial military, the planetary government of Rhapea conspired with the Empire to get rid of the Crimson Aces in hopes of sucking up to the new Imperial Order, which might otherwise subject all of Auril sector to the same kind of reprisals as Mercana. The Crimson Aces' planet-side facilities were seized, but they were able to get their fighters off the ground, escape, and went full mercenary, taking contracts all across the Outer Rim. The most famous planet in Auril sector is Ossus. Ossus' strategic position at the outskirts of the CIS political capital in the Tion cluster made it an important CIS fortress world. Along with Belderon and Felucia, Ossus was one of the strongholds that guarded the Tion cluster during the Outer Rim sieges. They never actually cracked, but instead surrendered after the assassination of the Separatist Council on Mustafar. But Ossus is more famous as one of the 3 planets alleged to be the homeworld of the Jedi Order, and the most likely candidate in my estimation, although Tython isn't unreasonable either. Tython is in the deep core, where the huge mass of stars and black holes makes hyperspace navigation difficult and maintenance of hyperspace routes demanding, so it makes sense that Tython might have been lost and later rediscovered. That said, Ossus is the oldest proven Jedi world and is probably the homeworld of the Order. Exar Kun sure gave a good faith effort to depopulating Ossus during the Exar Kun War, however. According to the Keldroma epics, which are not especially reliable but are nevertheless the most complete source we have on the era, the fallen Jedi-turned-Sith Lord was seeking secrets of the origins of the Sith Order from the 100 Years of Darkness, when the Jedi and the Sith split off from each other and the Sith were chased into what was then unknown space. Ossus was the greatest repository of knowledge of the Force in the galaxy, but in his efforts to capture the planet, Exar Kun totally devastated it. The inhabitants of the planet were reduced to a tribal state and developed a lot of superstitions about the Force from the surviving Jedi. The Jedi never fully rebuilt Ossus, and to this day it is mainly of archaeological significance, a barren world scarred by lightning. Luke did cite the Jedi Temple of his revived order there, but, well, that didn't work out. The Jedi had always been friendly to the Republic, but the Exar Kun War is what bound them together to the point where the Jedi were practically an organ of the Republic government. The Sith Brotherhood of that war was an alliance between the Krath, a secret dark side cult established amongst the aristocracy of the Empress Theta system, and the forces from Sith space under Exar Kun, a fallen Jedi. To the Krath, the enemy was Coruscant, who they sought to replace as the crown jewel of the core worlds and the rulers of the Republic. To Exar Kun, the enemy was the Jedi, who they sought revenge against for exiling the Dark Jedi in the 100 Years Darkness generations before. The Krath successfully captured Coruscant, but the Sith were repelled from Ossus despite the terrible damage they inflicted on the planet, and the Jedi led the effort to defeat Krath forces on Coruscant and pursued Exar Kun to his stronghold on Yavin 4, decisively defeating his Sith forces there. When the Jedi rebuilt their temple, they rebuilt on Coruscant, a stone's throw away from the Galactic Senate. That's not even the worst thing Sith forces did to the Auril sector during the Exar Kun War. The Sith sorceress Alima Cato destroyed multiple stars in the sector, creating the Kron Drift, a vast asteroid field filled with the debris of multiple destroyed systems. All these asteroid fields, located right near the Polemian trade route, made the area a great place for pirates to build secret bases, and the whole place has been pretty much continuously infested with them ever since. One of the stars destroyed was Urkup, taking with it the homeworld of the Dashade species. The Dashade are more force resistant than most species, so Jedi and Sith alike like to hire them to help train their warriors and assassins. One more remnant of the cradle of the Jedi Order, destroyed by one of the earliest of the Sith Wars. Greetings, my name is Chamomile, and this is an exploration of the entire galaxy sector by sector. Today, we're talking about the Belderone sector of the 12th Cerulean Spear Command. Dandrian is a planet which calls themselves the Crossroads of the Galaxy, because they are liars. Every sector has hundreds of tiny planets with a population of less than 1 million, and Dandrian is one of those, but I found their self-granted title to be sufficiently wrong as to be worth mentioning. This sector is also home to the gambling worlds Galsol and Bragkiss, and it's not too far away from the Wheel over in Maldrude sector. I don't know what it is about this part of the Prelemian trade route, but casinos love to operate here. Ord Marsax is one of the Ordnance Depot planets that the early Republic established. Back in the day, hyperspace travel took weeks or even months, which means it was important to have planets with just massive reserves of weapons, ammo, and rations where your fleets could refuel and rearm without having to spend 6 weeks retreating back to the core. Ord Marsax was the staging area for the Crusade of the Wilds, a campaign into what was then wild space, undertaken when the early Republic was having a religious phase and liked to call all their military campaigns crusades. The early Crusades targeted the Hutt Empire, but the Crusade of the Wilds was a military exploration expedition that both scouted out new territory and attacked anyone who looked at the Republic funny. What, did you think the Imperial era was the first time the Republic turned evil? The Crusade of the Wilds was less mask-off about it than some of the later ones, overly militarized but not outright murderous, but it was normalizing the idea of crusades against pretty arbitrary targets, and that precedent got used for outright genocides in a lot of the trailing crusades that followed. According to legend, Belderone sector is home to the four-armed Ichthydonian species? Anyway, these guys allegedly make for excellent bartenders. I'm pretty sure whoever originated these movies was thinking of the Basilisks, and might literally be deriving all of this from seeing Dexter Jettster in a Papanoida movie. Another legend says that the Jedi ditched a Sith holocron in the oceans of the obscure planet Kodai, hoping that leaving the holocron in the middle of a mostly uncharted ocean on an underpopulated world would defend it far better than any Jedi vault. Belderone sector was also home to planet Lola Sayu, where the Republic built a prison for holding dark Jedi, which the CIS repurposed to hold regular Jedi captured in the Clone Wars. The planet remained a separatist holdout even after the surrender of the CIS and had to be taken by force by the 12th Cerulean Spear. Without the backup of the rest of the Tion cluster and surrounding sectors, it went down quickly despite having resisted Republic invasion for months up to that point. Lola Sayu is not to be confused with Tiems, a minor world with a population of about 20 million that is also located in the Belderone sector, where several thousand rebel prisoners were held in a major prison in Tiems City. Tiems wasn't even primarily a prison planet, and to the extent that prison break is notable at all, it is mainly because the Rebel Alliance extraction was botched, so the rescue force and the rearmed prisoners were forced to fight off the Imperial Army garrison for about 36 hours, which they did using some clever maneuvers. Belderone is a rarity in the galaxy, a sector actually named after its most important planet. Belderone is one of several major shipyards built along the Prelemian trade route, and was the primary stronghold standing between Republic forces and the CIS core in the Tion cluster. The Republic struggled against Belderone and tried several routes around it, but other CIS strongholds at Felucia and Ossus stopped them in their tracks on the flanks, just the same as Belderone on the front. While most of the CIS were on their last legs by the time of the assassination of the Separatist Council on Mustafar, the capital and the Tion cluster was still pretty well fortified and had a decent buffer around it. By that point in the Clone Wars, the CIS had been cut into at least 4 different pieces, each one effectively a fully separate nation fighting the same enemy, but with no ability to reinforce one another. In most parts of the galaxy, the capitals of these fragments were already under siege when the Separatist Council was killed, and the Imperial mop-up operations overran what was left of the CIS forces in places like Siskine and Megiddo. Republic-turned Imperial forces were barely even on the outskirts of the Tion cluster, though, and CIS forces there could have tried to maintain the old CIS plan of fighting until an exhausted Republic agreed to hand over control of some part of the galaxy, just revising that plan down to a smaller part of the galaxy. With such a small amount of territory for the CIS, though, it would only be a matter of time before the Republic rested and came back for round 2, now with a big enough material advantage to be guaranteed victory. Plus, Palpatine was no longer accountable to the public and had no intention of settling for anything less than total control of the entire galaxy. Greetings, my name is Chamomile and this is an exploration of the entire galaxy sector by sector. Today we're talking about the Thanium worlds and the 12th Cerulean Spear Command. This part of the galaxy is soaked with history. It's the western fringe of the original sector boundaries of the Tion hegemony before the Republic turned Empire split that sector into 6 in order to weaken what had been the capital sector of the Confederacy of Independent Systems. The centers of political power were deeper into the Tion cluster, sectors like Allied Tion, the Cronies Mandate, and the new, reduced Tion hegemony sector. The Thanium worlds had always been a fringe of the cluster. The Tion cluster thought of themselves as the core worlds of the Outer Rim, and the number of major worlds packed inside the Thanium sector at the fringe of the old hegemony speaks to why. Illyrion is famous as a gambling planet, Vornax is a now barren planet that was once a major industrial world full of droid factories, until the Empire decided that it needed to make an example of at least a few Tianese planets, and Vornax was one of the unlucky winners of that lottery. Galadran is a snowy mountain planet, not full-on Hoth, think more fir trees. According to rumor, this was the site of a conflict between traditionalist Mandalorians and the Jedi, where Jango Fett fought Count Dooku and his apprentice Kamari Vosa, and Jango left an impression on Count Dooku with how many Jedi he killed that day. My rule about always including species homeworlds has come up for a couple of obscure ones in the 12th Cerulean Spear, so I'll mention here an exception to it. I don't include alleged species that only appear in children's comics or cartoons. It's not like it's impossible for real species to show up in these, but the Sumans here are most likely just funny cartoon aliens made up because the creators of the cartoon didn't want to use a real species. Since this is one of the sectors broken off from the Tion hegemony, the usual rules about species homeworlds getting their own sectors definitely don't apply, not that this rule was applied super evenly in this region of space to begin with. The Talburians are split into a race war between the blue-skinned ones and the purple-skinned ones, and the lack of unity has prevented them from getting much importance to the greater galaxy. The Burundi species of planet Burundi are documented only in Spacer tales. Sometimes spacers are racist. The Alzarians are a species of green-skinned humanoids whose only visual reference I can find is one of those kids' cartoons, but there are reasonably reliable historical records from the Sith Empire discussing the possibility of training them as Sith. Some guy named Darth Ravage had a grudge with them, though, and the Alzarians weren't so promising that other Sith Lords wanted to pick a fight over it. The Alzarians were also targets of the Stenax massacres, along with the Cadrillians and the Tharkos, who might be alien species or might just be the name of peoples from the asteroid Cadril or the planet Tharkos. Hard to say because there's not very many of them left on account of the massacres. Details on the massacres are hard to come by. They happened between Endor and Jakku, so that was still the era with no bureaucracy keeping track of things, so even though it's within living memory, it's all holonet rumors and spacer tales. The Stenaxis overthrew an Imperial garrison over a neighboring Spaja sector and started pursuing a bunch of racial grudges with nearby species. Rumor is the Mon Calamari came out and smacked the Stenaxis down. If that's true, it speaks to the extent to which New Republic forces absolutely ran roughshod over Greater Maldrude, even before the fall of the Empire. The fringe of the Tianese hegemony's maximum extent was also the fringe of the Sith core, the worlds consistently ruled by the Sith during the Old Republic era, even when the Republic, sarcastic air quotes, destroyed the Sith Empire, which usually meant killing the Sith Emperor and defeating the Sith fleet, and then, while the Sith Lords descended into infighting and warlordism for years or decades, Republic troops would fly over to Korriban or Zeost or wherever the capital was that time, plant some flags, take some photos, and since they had the run of the enemy capital, they declared the Sith Empire had been destroyed forever, and then they'd mostly leave, and the skeleton garrison left behind would get knocked over by warlords, or failing that, by the next time a Sith Emperor managed to weld all the other Sith Lords back together into one empire. So, the Tianese region of the galaxy is a fuzzy thing whose borders expanded and receded based on the fortunes of the Tianese hegemony in the very early Republic era, and the Sith region of the galaxy is a fuzzy thing whose borders expanded and receded based on the fortunes of the Sith Lords throughout the Old Republic era, and they overlap a lot, and the divide between 12th Cerulean Spear and their Tianese zone, and the 11th Blazing Claw and their Old Sith zone go straight through the middle. And some of the Tianese sectors end up in Blazing Claw because they are also Sith sectors, and some of the Sith sectors end up in 12th Cerulean Spear because they are also Tianese sectors, like the Thanium worlds, which includes Renvar and Felucia. Felucia has a native species of these things who have a dark side shamanin tradition. The Gossam colonized Felucia way back in the pre-Republic era, which is weird. They didn't show up anywhere else nearby, and it's also a hell of a hike to get there from their homeworld, which is in the colonies region near the core. Anyway, the Gossam set up shop in a couple of fortified cities, clearing the jungle to create farms, especially for the healing plant of Nicelin. The Gossam never got on particularly well with the natives, starting a pattern that continued when the planet was seized by Zim the Conqueror, then the Republic, then traded hands between the Republic and Sith over and over again. The Commerce Guild and their farming interests had a pretty consistent investment in the planet, as did, of course, the native population of Felucians. The tendril-faced Felucians, I mean. You might also recognize these Felucians. These are a Gossam evolutionary branch after a long time spent on Felucia, which speaks to the conditions of farming this disease-ridden, predator-infested death world, because evolution only occurs that quickly when a significant fraction of the population fails to reproduce, usually because they die before they get the chance. So there ended up being a three-way species divide: the original Felucians, who lived in the wilderness, the more rural Gossam evolved Felucians, and the original flavor Gossam who lived in the cities. None of these three like each other, and the conflict between them was a consistent factor regardless of who ruled this sector of space. The ties to the Commerce Guild and the proximity to the Tion cluster meant that Felucia went SEP in the Clone Wars. The planet had escaped a lot of the conflict in the Sith Wars because it was usually absorbed into a Sith Empire early on, and then rejoined the Republic with minimal resistance after a blow struck in Sith space. But in the Clone Wars, the Tion cluster wasn't a provincial fringe of the enemy empire, it was the core of the CIS. When Belderone stalled the Republic's attack up the Prolemian trade route, the Republic started looking for ways around, and the battle spread to Felucia and Ossus. Aayla Secura famously met her end on Felucia, which is famous mostly because both Felucia and Aayla Secura look great. Like, it was pretty much exactly the same thing as Stas Ali's betrayal on Salukami, but Salukami is boring. Look at this place, though. This place looks awesome. The CIS forces on Felucia surrendered soon after Order 66, once planets like Symirth and Megiddo began to fall, and the Tion cluster decided to give up rather than fight a doomed battle that would ruin their planets. The Imperial garrison was relatively light on Felucia, because Felucia is famously impossible to patrol and not very valuable once the Prolemian trade route was no longer blocked by an enemy army. Allegedly, Darth Vader's secret apprentice, a Sith assassin codenamed Starkiller, hunted down Shaak Ti here during the early rebellion. This story is supposed to be the story of the founding of the Rebel Alliance, but definitely isn't. That's a pretty well documented historical fact, and it was nothing like the stories about Starkiller. Plus, Starkiller is a codename some Rebel propagandists used for Luke Skywalker after the Battle of Yavin, when Red 5, the guy who blew up the Death Star, was the greatest hero Alliance propaganda had ever had, but people still wanted to keep his identity secret. Maybe they used the codename of a real guy who betrayed Darth Vader and helped the Rebel Alliance in its early days, but probably not. Theoretically, the story of a Sith assassin could be true, and definitely Shaak Ti's fate remains unknown. She never came forward after the New Republic was established and Luke refounded the Jedi Order, so probably she got killed at some point, but there's reports of her being killed during the CIS raid on Coruscant, the 501st Legion's attack on the Jedi Temple, or in the jungles of Felucia years later at the hands of some kind of Sith assassin. Renvar is another dark side-aligned planet nearby. The Rakatans got this one, and so did the Sith, who left behind a bunch of outposts here. Ulic Qel-Droma's tomb is located here and supposedly holds secrets of the Force Harvester, an ancient Sith superweapon that the CIS tried to unearth and reactivate on Raxus Prime. Republic forces stationed here since the days of the Sith Wars in the Old Republic era were quickly repelled by the CIS, both to keep the nearby Tion cluster secure and to keep Ulic Qel-Droma's secrets safe. But Anakin Skywalker will return and commune with Ulic Qel-Droma's ghost to learn the secrets of the Force Harvester and lead the GAR in the battle to destroy it. This is a story presented as based on real events that came out during the Clone Wars, which on the one hand is a contemporary account, but on the other hand it was also a propaganda story during a time of war, so grain of salt. Particularly since it involves a Republic raid on Raxus Prime, a stone's throw away from the capital of the CIS in the early stages of the war. That seems unlikely. Greetings, my name is Chamomile, and this is an exploration of the entire galaxy sector by sector. Today, we're looking at the Kalundra sector on the edge of dark space in 12th Cerulean Spear Command. There are a lot of alleged species homeworlds out in Kalundra, but the only confirmed species are the four-armed Zexto of planet Troikan, a species you might recognize from Gasgano of the Golden Age of pod racing. The Zexto live in the thin band of habitable forest that encircles the tidally locked planet of Troikan, with a frozen wasteland of eternal night on one end and a boiling wasteland of eternal day on the other. In between, in the arboreal zone of eternal twilight, is the only place with livable temperatures. Luckily, this is a planet we're talking about, so this narrow strip is like 150 miles wide. The Zexto are not to be confused with the Quermians, a genetically modified variant species created by the mad geneticists of Arcania. Those guys live over in the Nilgard sector, so odds are that video will be coming out pretty soon if you want to know more about long-necked King Yariel Poof. Also living in the Kalundra sector are the avian Gazo species of Dragor 3. I don't know why these guys didn't get their own sector. There's not a whole lot of information on their culture as a whole, and when individual Gazo show up, they're always living on another planet, usually Troikan. Maybe Dragor 3 is another name for Troikan? Species home systems often have unique names for every planet in addition to the standard names based on a named star, like the most densely populated world over in the Galov sector is the third planet of the Opoku system, which you could call Opoku 3, but which is actually called Gamor, as in Gamorrean pigs. Maybe Troikan is the proper name of Dragor 3, and there's 2 native species on it. Kalundra sector is allegedly home to not 1 but 2 primitive planets conquered by the Empire and later liberated with the help of the Rebel Alliance, Kashun and Kruskan. While this kind of thing did happen at all, and Kalundra sector's position at the very fringe of the galaxy made it relatively more likely for a primitive species to be discovered this late into galactic history than in, say, the heart of the nearby Tion cluster, Kalundra sector is also the end of the Prelemian trade route, the very first hyperroute the Republic blazed out to the Outer Rim. Kalundra sector is one of the oldest Republic sectors, so I'm guessing that at least one and probably both of these 2 planets aren't actually home to one of these caveman species people love to tell stories about. More likely they were home to pretty ordinary rebel cells, and they might even be completely made up. Kruskan's story is especially far-fetched. Apparently it was colonized by the Republic and then just forgotten about before becoming home to a force cult led by someone named Regera Giron, who then enslaved a Republic exploration vessel when it rediscovered the planet in the Old Republic era. This isn't the Negs or the Deep Core, in fact it's pretty much the opposite. Here at the edge of the galaxy, gravity wells are thinning out to absolutely nothing, and hyperspace routes are extremely durable, requiring almost no maintenance at all. You don't just lose track of a planet out here. Son Vilmari is a planet whose native species, the Panpreneur, look a lot like Mon Calamari, and this might actually just be a far-flung Mon Calamari colony with some spacer myth-making attached to it. On the other hand, the Togruta and the Twi'lek look pretty similar, but that's by pure coincidence. Back on the first hand, the Togruta and the Twi'lek's homeworlds are way far away from each other, but the Panpreneur are only 2 sectors away from Calamari space. I don't have the credits to go and check, but I'm guessing these guys are just Mon Calamari and spaces are telling tales again. You might recognize Barton 4 as that one ice planet where Clone Commander Mayday and his squad had a bad time right after the Clone Wars. This isn't a major world, but it was in a well-received holoshow, so I know someone will find that interesting. The supply depot there was important-ish to keeping the Tion cluster, former capital of the CIS, surrounded, but it wasn't like a major supply depot. You know, Colmex and Liana further down the Prelemian trade route were more important for that. The big story of the Kalundra sector, though, is the Stark Hyperspace War in the Late Republic, about a decade before the blockade of Naboo. The Stark Commercial Combine, despite the name, is a pirate alliance who also took on significant mercenary bounty hunting and assassination work in the Tion periphery. During a Bacta shortage, the Trade Federation made a killing shipping Bacta from Thifera in the Trailing Core out to the Outer Rim, and the Stark Combine made a killing stealing Bacta from the Trade Federation after it reached the Outer Rim but before it was unloaded. The Trade Federation escalated the armaments on their ships and the size of their battle-droid marine forces to defend themselves from the pirate raids. The Republic sent a Jedi delegation led by Plo Koon to try and negotiate an end to the conflict, but negotiations broke down, at least partly because of the machinations of Ranulf Tarkin, the senator of Iriadu who was hoping to re-establish the Republic Navy using a crisis like this one. Whatever Tarkin's hopes, what the Republic actually had was Plo Koon, a few other Jedi, and a featherweight infantry security force who didn't have Plex missiles, heavy blasters, or other squad or platoon-level support weapons. Due to the political clusterfuck that happened when the bumbling manipulations of Ranulf Tarkin encountered those of Trade Federation leader Newt Gunray, the Republic security forces under Tarkin, the battle droids of the Trade Federation, the pirates of the Stark Combine, and Plo Koon and the other Jedi traded off alliance with one another a couple of times in battles across both Troika and the arid planet Util, a minor world whose monarch was, fun fact, bounty hunted by Bosk a few decades later. After several weeks of conflict across the Kalundra sector, the Stark Combine was eventually smashed to pieces, and Tarkin had mostly humiliated himself. The anti-militarist Senator Valorum of Coruscant got himself elected Chancellor, and that was it for any hopes of restoring the Republic Navy until the invasion of Naboo 8 years later. Something that was facilitated by the war with the Stark Combine, which provided the Trade Federation the excuse they needed to, at Darth Sidious's direction, massively expand their battle droid forces. So, by fucking up negotiations really badly, Ranulf Tarkin justified the Trade Federation in maintaining a large battle droid army indefinitely, which they used to invade Naboo, which, along with his visions, led Sifo Dyas to unwittingly help Palpatine commission the clone army from Kamino, which became the Grand Army of the Republic. Just as planned. Greetings, my name is Chamomile, and this is an exploration of the entire galaxy sector by sector. Today, we're looking at the Dominus sector in 12th Cerulean Sphere, a little pocket of unknown space at the edge of the slice. Like most Republic sectors, Dominus sector is the domain of a specific species and culture, in this case, the Dornians. The Dornians are leathery-skinned purple humanoids from one of the fringe sectors who joined the Rebel Alliance after the destruction of Alderaan absolutely cemented a galaxy-wide hatred of the Empire, and then a week later the destruction of the Death Star made them look weak. Like their neighbors in Calamari space, the Dornians fought off Imperial efforts at putting down their open rebellion. The Dornian gunship was an early staple of the Rebel fleet even before the Battle of Yavin, and with Calamari space right next door, it's no surprise that the Dornians decided to make a stand. Probably no pair of sectors were better positioned to defy the Empire so openly, between their remote location, making it difficult for 12th Cerulean Sphere to supply large fleets for extended missions, and their strong local shipbuilding industries allowing them to field and supply fleets of their own. Dornian gunships and Mon Calamari cruisers together make a pretty solid backbone for a navy. There's also a ton of rumors about the Dominus sector. It's way in the Outer Rim, so that's not too surprising. According to rumor, Dominus sector is home to planet Barros, a high-gravity planet pummeled by sandstorms, and homeworld of the Brub species, a species discovered by the Empire. According to the rumor, the Brubs discovered the rest of the galaxy on their own, sending out messages from early modern comms tech on the surface to see if anyone was listening. Barros shows up on pretty reputable star charts, so the planet itself definitely exists, but there are a ton of stories of the Galactic Empire discovering caveman planets in the Outer Rim and attempting to subjugate them with mixed success. This definitely happened at least once or twice. Endor is a particularly well-known example, but not all of these stories can be true. There just weren't that many unexplored planets in or near the slice by the Imperial era. Exploration efforts on many planets are pretty token. Someone just flies a freighter down to check for air, land, and sea, a breathable atmosphere, solid ground to walk on, and enough of a water cycle to grow crops. So sometimes planetary civilizations get missed because an explorer can fly down, check the atmospheric and soil conditions, and blast off without ever noticing that anyone's built a city down there. But cities tend to have a lot of biosignatures and produce a lot of heat and otherwise show up on sensors from orbit. Yeah, sensors aren't super reliable, but a planetary civilization is so hard to miss that they usually work anyway. I guess the sandstorms might have hidden Brub civilization? The planet Soleil was supposedly taken over by a tyrant in the late Republic era, a tyrant who became a vassal of the Galactic Empire until Luke Skywalker helped the Resistance, ongoing for decades, to finally overthrow their evil king Blackheart. The Imperial military reconquered the planet and forced Luke to flee. And I guess the Dornians were just kind of okay with this? They'd been holding Dominus sector against the Empire for years at this point. The Dornians' fight against the Empire was touch and go enough that it's not totally implausible one planet slipped between the gaps like this, but it's weird that they didn't even show up in the story. Maybe they were more involved, and it's just that people like to tell stories about Luke Skywalker and other people involved tend to fade into the background? Or maybe this is Luke toppling a planetary government after they wore out his patience. He did that to Jabba, the de facto ruler of Tatooine, so it's not like it isn't within his abilities. That guy was scary. The planet Tralia is a jungle planet and allegedly has a stone-tech sentient native population. An Imperial research team set up shop there and conducted all kinds of mad experiments on the natives trying to develop weapons for the Empire until a rebel cell came and helped the Tralians take out the research base. Dominus is positioned at the edge of the galaxy, and thick jungles make it the kind of place where a stone-tech civilization could go unnoticed, but spacers do like to tell stories. Officially, the ocean planet of Solanus has no sentient life on it, but legends say that the ocean itself is a vast sentient life form, with electrical lattices in the saltwater firing like synapses. Woo! This kind of thing is by no means impossible, but spacers like to tell stories, so who knows. It's hard to tell how many of these stories are true, but if even half of them are real, the Dornians must have been barely hanging on to the sector during the Galactic Civil War because the Rebels and the Empire were both pretty active here. Greetings, my name is Chamomile, and this is an exploration of the entire galaxy sector by sector. Today, we're talking about the Calamari sector, also known as Mon Calamari Space, in 12th Cerulean Spear Command. Mon Calamari Space is about as close to the platonic ideal of a Republic sector as you're going to get, even if it does come with a big asterisk. The sector capital is Dak, also known as Mon Cala, and all the other planets are colony worlds of the native species of Dak, planets like Gamant, Ruisto, and Mintuine. The sector is the domain of Dak and its native species, the part of the galaxy given over to them to rule according to their own traditions and represented in the Galactic Senate by a senator. The big asterisk on that is that Dak is home to no less than 5 sentient species. The two you're most likely familiar with are the Mon Calamari, who are dominant on the coastal and surface waters and thus have the most interactions with the outside galaxy, and the Quarren, the Mon Calamari's main rivals who live much deeper in the oceans. These two are very well attested to historically, so much so that it's weird to talk about them being well attested to historically. Yeah, there's definitely strong evidence the Mon Calamari exist, for example, that Mon Calamari guy who lives a few doors down from my apartment. But there's also reports of a small population of telepathic amphibious creatures called the Amphihydrus, who allegedly took over Dak at one point long ago, but subsequently lost power to an alliance between the Mon Calamari and the Quarren, who set aside their differences to depose the telepathic tyrants. I'm skeptical of this one, mainly because you'd think these Amphihydrus guys would show up again in galactic politics ever, and they haven't. Also allegedly native to Dak are the Whalodons, a sentient species of whales whose size and lack of opposable thumbs means they don't participate much in wider galactic society, and sentient jellyfish who can barely even communicate with most sentient species. The evidence for these guys isn't amazing, but there's a straightforward reason why they don't show up more often in the historical record, so I don't find it nearly as hard to believe that these guys exist as opposed to the Amphihydrus. The Mon Calamari and the Quarren do not get along. While the Mon Calamari colonized Calamari space because they lived on the surface, could see the stars, and like so many species before and after them, they eventually decided they were going to go check those things out no matter how much space was in the way, the Quarren got in on it because they caught wind the Mon Calamari had started colonizing other planets and didn't want to fall behind. Because their civilization exists almost purely underwater, the Mon Calamari didn't contact the Republic until near the end of the early Republic era, not long before the First Sith War. It didn't help that Calamari space is right at the edge of dark space, which is a somewhat remote location even for a sector that's near-ish to the Tion cluster, which is a hub of dense population and civilization out in the Outer Rim. This remote location was only half the reason the Mon Calamari didn't join the Republic until all the way into the High Republic era, though. The other reason is that the Quarren were and are dominated by a culture of paranoid xenophobia and didn't want their planet in the Republic. Once the Sith War started, the Republic was happy to have the Mon Calamari as allies and tabled full accession to the Republic for generations. The sector didn't see a whole lot of action in the Sith Wars. The Sith had a fortress on Taral 5, but it wasn't a major colony of the Mon Calamari or the Quarren, and the Sith never had control over a major world like Dak. The militarization of the region did have an impact, however. Mon Calamari didn't join the Republic until after the Ruusan Reformation, when the lack of a central military soothed Quarren fears of foreign military presence on their homeworld and colonies. It probably would have happened a lot sooner if the Republic didn't have fairly significant military presence there because of the Sith Wars. The Quarren and Mon Calamari would go on to be on opposite sides of the Clone Wars, but would stand together in the Galactic Civil War. In both cases, the Mon Calamari decided to pick what seems like the worst possible side of the war, and then they just made it work. During the Clone Wars, Calamari space was on the doorstep of the Tion cluster, the capital of the Confederation of Independent Systems. Sectors like Gallus, capitaled from the Twi'lek homeworld of Ryloth, tried to maintain neutrality under far less dire circumstances. But although the CIS did support a Quarren takeover of Mon Calamari, the Mon Calamari were ultimately able to defeat the Quarren and hold the CIS off for the duration of the Clone Wars. It helped a lot that the Hutts unexpectedly sided with the Republic. But, Hutt space doesn't start until a few sectors trailing Calamari space, even if we give them the most generous interpretation of their fuzzy borders. So, Calamari space was well and truly surrounded. The Republic was able to send some support via Hutt space, most famously Kit Fisto, and repelled multiple attacks from the CIS. Their capital in Coral City was briefly overrun, and after seizing it back from the CIS, the Republic agreed to give the Quarren a separate representative in the Galactic Senate in exchange for the Quarren rejoining the Republic. The Mon Calamari picked what seemed like the wrong side and made it work anyway in the Galactic Civil War as well, openly rebelling against the Empire soon after the destruction of the first Death Star. They were consolidated with the Quarren at this time, both of them supporting the rebels over the Empire, and they were far away from any Imperial strongholds. But on the other hand, while you probably think of the Outer Rim as being rebel territory for most of the Galactic Civil War, the reason we think of it that way is because the Mon Calamari openly seceded from the Galactic Empire, the Empire sent a fleet to subdue their rebellion, and they just lost. This was among several victories in the Outer Rim that led the rebels to attempt the Mid-Rim offensive, which ultimately failed, but Dak never fell to any Imperial counterattack. They were, effectively, the first world of the New Republic. Greetings, my name is Chamomile, and this is an examination of the entire galaxy sector by sector. Today, we're looking at the Nilgard sector and 12th Cerulean Spear Command. I don't know what it is about the Prolemian trade route, but this section of space is packed with species homeworlds. Practically every sector out here really should have been 3 or 4. Some of these species are hard to verify, and in particular the nearby Kalundra sector had a few that sounded a lot like someone overheard a story about Ewoks and ripped it off for their own totally unverifiable tale of galactic adventure, but at least 2 of the species there are definitely real. Nilgard ups the ante on that. There are 4 verified sentient species homeworlds out here. The one you're most likely to recognize are the Quermians, because Long King Yariel Poof was a meme like 6 years ago. The Quermians of planet Quermia are a colony of the Zexto of planet Troikan over in the Kalundra sector, but although the Quermians were originally Zexto, their colony was established in cooperation with the mad geneticists of Arcania, and there are a significantly taller species overall, especially in the neck. The Quermians had strong ties with the Jedi, so in the Imperial era they fell off the grid as completely as possible. They've been friendly with the New Republic since establishment, but being in a hotbed of Imperial remnant activity and near the very edge of the galaxy has complicated their readmission as a member world. They did get back most of the religious relics that the Empire looted and took to Coruscant, though, so there's that. The second species is the Whippids of planet Tula in the Kael'ta system. Whippids are off-brand Wookiees, furry guys about 7 or 8 feet tall who live in tribes focused on hunting for sustenance on their ice planet home. They meet at hot springs, and despite their hunter culture, they are not known to engage in war with each other. There have been Whippid Jedi, no one you've ever heard of, and Whippid bodyguards for Imperial officers, but for the most part, these guys keep to themselves. Normally, a species like this, I would guess, is a Wookiee colony that spacers are telling tales about, but we've got thoroughly verified pictures of them, and while they're similar, they're clearly a distinct species. Plus, while we are coincidentally in the same over-sector command as Kashyyyk, Nilgard sector is on the rimward edge of the Outer Rim. Kashyyyk is on the coreward edge of the mid-rim. They're actually quite far away from each other. The Swokes are from the planet Makam Te. You might recognize this species from this food merchant. Jar Jar was complaining about how they couldn't go back into the streets or else they'd get mugged like 10 seconds earlier, and immediately he decides to rob this random woman. Anyway, the Swoke's homeworld of Makam Te is ruled by the Congress of Caliphs, a senate of princes drawn from a military theocracy/aristocracy. I can only describe their culture as very extra, and yet in a brutalist kind of way. They do everything intentionally. They have professional mourners and lavish funerals and cities made of cast iron. They're a fairly militant society, and yet they're also very spiritually focused, and their reverence for their ancestors has led to the creation of a vast cemetery called the Tract, which takes up about 7% of the planet's total landmass. Makam Te was conquered by Zim the Despot, but broke away from the Tion hegemony after Zim's death and remained independent until they joined the Republic much later in the early Republic era. At the time of the Clone Wars, the Congress of Caliphs had brought in significant outside investment to mine up some valuable ore, and the common people of Makam Te became more attached to their ancient customs in reaction. The Republic had to send peacekeepers to tamp down tensions between new religious sects like the Temple of the Beautiful Razor and the Congress of Caliphs, and when the Clone Wars erupted, the CIS leveraged that to their advantage, offering to replace the Republic peacekeepers who, now unable to call in reinforcements, were being quickly shredded by Razor rebels, but naturally only if Makam Te joined the CIS. The Congress of Caliphs was split, and especially near the war's end, when it became clear that the Republic was going to win, loyalist Caliphs fought against separatists to retain the good graces of the Republic turned Empire. It mostly worked, and the Swokes had a reasonably good relationship with all 3 of the Empire, Greater Maldrude, and Zinj's successor Empire, who captured Nilgard Sector 1 after the other. Our last species are the Carcharodons of Carcharis. They were pro-CIS and fought with CIS forces on Mon Cala, hoping to get some of the Mon Calamari Waterworld colonies in the region out of the war. No word on what happened to them after the Seps lost. Maybe they went off-grid to avoid Imperial retribution like the Quermians, or maybe when the Empire retributed them so hard that they still haven't recovered. As far as I can tell, the Nilgard sector is supposed to be the domain of the Congress of Caliphs. They definitely had Senate representation in the late Republic, and the other species of the sector have some reasons why they might not have had Senate representation, or the semi-sovereign status of sector governments. It's not clear when Macabte joined the Republic, but given it's near the Tion cluster, it was probably very early in the early Republic era, before the Quermians settled Quermia, more towards the middle of that era, which means the Quermians might not have their own sector because Quermia was already someone else's planet when they got there, even if the Swoke weren't really using it for anything. The Whippids have a sparse population, hunters on an ice planet, and between their primitive tech and their thin population, they might have just been passed over. The Carcharodon civilization might have been hidden from view by their submarine nature, especially from early Republic scouts who were more concerned with getting an edge on the Hutts than on fully, thoroughly, and scientifically surveying a planet. These are flimsy reasons to cram 4 species into one sector, but that's the Republic bureaucracy for you. This part of the galaxy was also home to lots of little skirmishes between the Rebels and the Empire. Galshebis Prime was the site of a battle where Rebels holed up in a warehouse before taking advantage of technical flaws in Imperial Army pulsehammer blasters to wipe out the troopers. An Imperial Army colonel was assassinated on Minta. Emmer was an Imperial fortress world, but Rebel forces cracked it in between Endor and Jakku. I couldn't find any specifics, but it seems clear that there was a very active rebel cell here after Yavin 4, and which successfully liberated the sector before the formal establishment of the New Republic after Jakku. Greetings, my name is Chamomile, and this is an exploration of the entire galaxy sector by sector. Today, we're looking at the Pakuni sector in 12th Cerulean Spear Command. Like many other sectors, Pakuni is the domain of a specific species, governed according to their customs and traditions. In this case, it's the Lamproids of the planet Florn, a jungle death world so dangerous that it's said you can only survive there if you have some kind of enhanced reflexes, like a cybernetic augment or force powers. The Lamproids are themselves venomous bloodsuckers with a culture, if you can call it that, based purely around hunting. Sentient lizards and whales and monkeys all produce art and music and so forth, but not Lamproids. They do what they need to in order to survive, and that's it. When they have plenty of food and water and so forth, they just kind of lie around. No drive for self-actualization. But that's all because they're especially alien aliens. Don't mistake it for stupidity. They're perfectly capable of long-term planning, and some of them joined the Rebel Alliance because the Empire posed a long-term threat to all aliens, especially the unpopular Outer Rim ones. There's also some weird rumors, as is the usual way of the Outer Rim. Supposedly, the planet Munto Kodru is home to the Kodru-G species, and Leia Organa took her 3 kids there for a trip to obscure Outer Rim sectors of the New Republic, and the Kodru-G have a tradition of highly ritualized kidnapping of political rivals' children, which was used as cover for an actual kidnapping by Imperial remnants. The very vague outline of this may have happened, but there's a lot wrong here. The story refers to Leia's kids as being named Jaina, Jason, and Anakin. Leia had 1 child, and his name was Ben. Given the ages of Leia's children in this story, this would have been at least 10 years after the Battle of Jakku and the establishment of the New Republic. By that time, the First Order was still many years away from being openly declared, but it existed in practice, and its policy was to avoid antagonizing the New Republic while building strength in the Outer Rim. Kidnapping Leia Organa's child or children is the opposite of that. Other than Leia Organa herself, this story seems purely fictional, but given at least 1 real person does appear, it's possible that the planet of Monto Kundru and the Kodru-G native species are also legit. I want them to be real, because they're 6-legged wolves who somehow metamorphose into 4-armed humanoids during puberty, but although this isn't unheard of, and I don't mean other obscure alien species, I mean like butterflies, an animal which exists on more inhabited planets than not. But this kind of thing does show up more often in Spacer Tales than in reality. The Kodru-G are supposedly xenophobes with little contact with the greater galaxy, which is one of those explanations which, yeah, does explain why they aren't part of the Republic, but it's awfully convenient that the craziest species are always isolationists who never leave their home planet. Of course, I say that, but this sector's confirmed species are the talking lampreys. The story only gets crazier, though. After Jason Solo and his 2 phantom siblings are kidnapped, the Imperial Remnant, who is not Greater Maldrude but some kind of Inquisitor, takes them to Crusade Station in the otherwise uninhabited Crusade system, where this ex-Inquisitor guy had been running experiments on interdimensional travel using hyperspace. Quick, find the dimension where Organa won the 09 election and the First Order was nipped in the bud. Back in reality, the Rebel Alliance fought a number of battles in the Pakuni sector after the Battle of Yavin, when the 1-2 punch of the destruction of Alderaan and the destruction of the Death Star led to a lot of Outer Rim sectors joining their open rebellion against the Empire. These early victories are what led the rebels to think the mid-rim offensive would be a good idea. Before the Battle of Yavin, a rebel listening post on Daltara was hunted down by Imperial forces, but after, the rebels won victory after victory at Shaylin 18, Cyrus, and Ton Falk. These were all fleet actions in space, so the planets themselves weren't super important, they were just in the background, but the Pakuni victories helped shore up the rebels' fledgling control over the very edge of the galaxy, alongside other sectors like Dominus Sector and Calamari Space, becoming a little pocket of the New Republic years before it was formally established. Greetings, my name is Chamomile and this is an exploration of the entire galaxy sector by sector. Today, we're talking about Bortele Sector. Bortele's major world is currently Hypatria, but only because the Jinn species Jatek worlds were depopulated by the Empire. I can't find any record of why, but the Empire doesn't always need a reason. Information is sparse enough that this one might just be a rumor, though. Hypatria struggles to be worthy of the title of Major World. According to rumor, a rebel operative and his droid R2ZDL started spying on Imperial ship activity in Hypatria. The operative was killed by a local crime lord who used the power of crimes to monopolize the planet's docking, refueling, and ship repair industry. An R2ZDL, who was looted by the crime lord and put to work in the starport, hacked the systems of that monopoly to ensure that Imperial ships were always docked at whatever bay he happened to be working that day, so he could steal all their information and smuggle it to the Rebel Alliance. This sector is also home to some fun minor worlds, including another species homeworld, Ultar. The Ultarians are yet another four-armed species, and one sufficiently sparsely documented that they might be yet another Outer Rim spacer seeing a basilisk for the first time and confidently proclaiming he has found a brand new sentient species. Ultar is a jungle world where a small rebel cell was in operation until the Empire sent a bounty hunter named Baylord Valence to dig them out. There are some four-armed people down there. They might be basilisk colonists. They might be an actual native species. Pay me 20,000 credits and I will fly out to the Outer Rim to check. Resilon is a mining world where there was a droid revolt by 8D smelter droids, and Ingo was a snow planet with a hard-bitten population of survivors, which I bring up only because I think towns stubbornly clinging to survival amidst the snowdrifts are cool. This footage is from Frostpunk, a completely unrelated video game which I bring up only because it has the same vibe. Greetings, my name is Chamomile and this is an exploration of the entire galaxy sector by sector. Today, we're looking at the Bricks sector, where our motto is, I swear I'm not making this up. I mean, we've had Outer Rim sectors where spacers swear there's a whole planet of angels or hidden Sith fleets or sexy cat girls, so really all that's weird about the fairy tales from this sector is that this is actually the Mid-Rim. Now, the Anzadi species is real and they do feed primarily on neural systems, and they do lack a taboo against eating sentience. With a high brain size to body size ratio, sentients are a pretty good source of food for them, so they are legitimately people-eating monsters. With a starting point like that, you can imagine the kinds of stories spacers tell. The Anzadi are super strong, super fast, have hypnotic powers, natural telepathy, accelerated healing, rainbow hair, and heterochromia. Only the last two of those are made up. I mean, probably at least half of that is made up, but the last two I made up just now. The Anzadi devour brains by extending two proboscis on tendrils in their cheeks down the nostrils of the victim, rendering the brain matter into a sludge they call soup, which is why some people call them snot vampires. These less glamorous tales seem more plausible to me, and, you still definitely don't want to meet one of these guys in a dark alleyway. Their homeworld of Anzad is allegedly located in Brick Sector, but this kind of thing is hard to verify. Brick Sector has a couple of other fun stories lying around. There was a crazy prophet on the desert planet of Dumai who turned out to be a clone trooper who suffered a brain injury that caused the Kaminoan hypnotic indoctrination to get scrambled in his head. Jakara is an officially uninhabited ice planet where the Crimson Dawn auctioned off Han Solo's carbonite statue after they acquired it from Boba Fett. Kijimi is another ice planet used as a smuggler haven by the Ashiga clan. You might recognize Wobani as the planet whose native population was entirely and forcibly relocated by the Empire so they could use it as a planet-wide forced labor camp in which Jyn Erso was imprisoned when the Rebel Alliance sprung her. So, good times all around in Brick Sector. I know the destruction of Alderaan was an atrocity, but are we sure Death Stars are entirely a bad idea? I feel like we could start shooting into the Brick Sector at random and it would still be an improvement for the galaxy overall. Greetings, my name is Chamomile and this is an exploration of the entire galaxy sector by sector. Today, we're looking at the Hala sector, the sector where everyone died. I mean, not literally everyone, it's a pretty typical sector, 1,000-ish planets, 90% of the population is concentrated into a handful of major worlds with hundreds of millions to billions of people, and then there's hundreds and hundreds of other inhabited worlds with less than a million each that add up to less than a billion between them. The planet Morn was ruled in the early Republic era by the Sultan Nasuwanadon, however you pronounce that. He created one of the first droid armies called the Electric Caliphs. At this point, the biological population of his planet was apparently redundant to him because although we don't know the details, everyone died. The Hutts came later to enlist the aid of the Electric Caliphs in dealing with the Garganteles, a species of giants who stood 60 feet tall on the planet of Boz Pity. The Hutts wanted to enslave the Garganteles to make use of their enormous strength, but no amount of Nikto slave armies could subdue the massive, powerful monsters. The Hutts turned to the Electric Caliphs. The records are vague on the details here, but the legends say that the Electric Caliphs couldn't be used to subjugate the Garganteles, only to destroy them. And that was good enough for the Hutts. The war was fought over the planet for 10 years, and the Garganteles left behind enormous gravestones from the enormous casualties. They went down hard, but in the end, everyone died. After the death of the Garganteles, the Electric Caliphs returned to Morn, and every single one of them set themselves on fire. Legends say the fires burned for a century, and by the time they finished, everyone died. Hathrox 3 was a fully developed major world which, near the end of the Old Republic era, descended into civil war. This was during the absolute chaos of the last Sith Wars, when the Republic effectively ceased to exist, degrading into a loose coalition of everyone who opposed the Sith. The Republic was pretty much rebuilt from nothing in the Ruusan Reformation, although it used the same basic legal framework as they had before, and the Hathrock Civil War happened pretty close to the Ruusan Reformation when the Republic was at the nadir of its de facto disintegration, which means the whole war was waged entirely without the galactic or even sector government really noticing or caring. As the Civil War dragged on, the fighters started relying more and more on biochemical bombardments because firing WMDs from giant artillery didn't require as many functioning bodies as assaulting or holding a trench line. After the Ruusan Reformation, the Republic started checking up on all the planets that had fallen off the map 200 years ago to make sure they hadn't died, and discovered they were too late on this one. The New Republic sent scouts down to the Chemical Ocean to check the planet's habitability, and despite their precautions, every one of them died. Danuda is a planet of Badlands farmers and miners where the Empire sited a Death Star superlaser research facility. A single reactor superlaser was built on the planet and test-fired at point-blank range into the crust, which created a glassy black lake of liquefied and then recooled crust. The pollutant runoff of the test firings played hell on the environment, which was already pretty marginal for the people living there. Environmental damage was so extensive that some of them died. Not a lot, though. Like, people's farms collapsed and they were impoverished. It wasn't okay, but only in a few extreme cases did people actually starve to death due to the superlaser pollution. They can't all fit the theme. Ord Thabil was one of the Ordnance Depot planets established by the Republic in the early Republic era when hyperdrives were slow enough that it wasn't practical to ship munitions directly from manufacturing planets like Bestine out to the front lines in an Outer Rim war. These Ordnance Depot planets got used as the launch points for a lot of the Republic's so-called crusades when they were in their Pius Dea phase. Pius Dea was a religious metastasization of high human culture that became popular enough in the early Republic that the Supreme Chancellor was a member pretty much continuously for several generations. This was the era when the Republic's main rival was the Hutt Empire, and Ord Thabil was the launchpad for the so-called Third Crusade, an attack on nearby Hutt space. Records aren't super clear on exactly how well that went, but Hala Sector was the doorstep of Hutt space then, and it's the doorstep of Hutt space now, so clearly the whole crusade didn't move the border at all, which means we're back on theme. When Aayla Secura was a Padawan in the late Republic era, she and her Jedi Master Quinlan Vos went on a mission to Zoman 3 in Hala Sector, where they rescued a princess who had been kidnapped by skyboat pirates. Available records aren't clear on exactly how many people died, but, I mean, there were lightsabers involved. Probably at least a couple of pirates died. It's not really on theme, and Zoman 3 doesn't really have a huge population, but it's cool and I want to talk about it. Rescuing a princess from sky pirates! And for all the talk of everyone always dying, Hala Sector is, like most Republic sectors, the domain of a specific culture semi-sovereign under the Galactic Republic, and that culture is the Sejan Siji, an alien species who build their cities into canyons and have a long culture of peaceful protest. No one's gotten around to killing all of them yet, even though they would presumably just wave signs about it. And the planet with the largest population in the sector is Bimasari, a planet colonized by the Bims, a furry species about 3 to 4 feet tall. Bimasari is a major trade world, and some reports even refer to it as the sector capital, although I think that's probably wrong since it's a colony and there's a species homeworld in the same sector, and no sign of why that might have happened. The sectors are formed in ways that don't line up with the hypothetical ideal of being the domain of a specific culture all the time, but there's usually some kind of reason why, so I suspect that what's going on here is that Bimasari is the planet in Hala sector that everyone has actually heard of, so people blindly assume it's the sector capital even though it's actually Sejan Siji. Verified sources don't say for sure. Anyway, what's important is that so far, not all of them have died. Give it time though, maybe the Hutts are cooking something up. Greetings, my name is Chamomile, and this is an exploration of the entire galaxy sector by sector. Today, we're talking about Jubilar Sector in 12th Cerulean Spear Command. I try to always mention sentient species homeworlds when they come up. I don't want to say that any sentient species is too unimportant to show up in what's supposed to be an exploration of the entire galaxy. But the only thing on record about the Hardex is that they are rumored to exist. With information that sparse, I'm inclined to believe it's just another spacer who wants you to believe he somehow discovered a sentient species in thoroughly explored space. Rumor is that there's a cyborg cult on Yaled 4 who worship a war robot named Zim, Z-I-M-M, who allegedly has the brain of the original Zim, X-I-M, the despot, uploaded to him. Nothing ever really seems to have come of this, so I guess that cyborg cult is still there? Just chillin'? Sectors usually get named after whichever planet shows up most often in Republic bureaucracy, which gets kind of dark for Jubilar Sector, named after Jubilar, the prison planet. The New Republic kept using the prison after the war, making it one of the only Imperial prison planets that the New Republic kept in operation. I guess you have to have somewhere to stick your serial killers and your war criminals, and 25 years for harboring a wanted criminal? Was this guy harboring, like, an Imperial moth who killed a planet or something? Or does the New Republic give you 25 years if you hide your cousin in your basement after he robs a convenience store? No wonder no one showed up to fight the First Order for these guys. Greetings, my name is Chamomile, and this is an examination of the entire galaxy sector by sector. Today, we're looking at the Philim sector of 12th Cerulean Spear Command. There's a couple of alleged species homeworlds out here. 12th Cerulean is just jam-packed with species homeworlds that show no sign of having their own sector. This isn't unheard of or anything, but still, the nominal structure of a Republic sector is that it is the domain of a specific culture and tradition, and if there's a species homeworld in a sector, it usually means the sector is that species' culture and tradition. On the other hand, a lot of these alleged species homeworlds are so sketch that I question my rule of including them all. The Hall Wolves of Planet Aliga definitely exist, although the only photographic record of them is this murky bullshit. The Koans from Planet Koan allegedly played a gambling game called Fantan against Han Solo one time. The supposed Pui-Ui are described as two spherical bodies connected by a half-meter-long neck, and seem to be notable mainly for how hard their anatomy is for surgeons and other doctors to work with. And the Vunakians are supposedly a human culture, so not strictly speaking a species homeworld, but they have a caste system and a whole culture of scarification, and they sound pretty metal, but they're also the kind of thing you'd expect a sector to be built around. That said, Vunakia is said to be a human colony world, not the human homeworld. That's Coruscant, of course. So it's possible these guys set up shop here on an uncolonized planet after the sector was already established. With the exception of the Hall Wolves, who, even if they barely exist, are on the record as having Senate representation pretty unambiguously, most of these sound like Spacer Tales. They're not nearly the coolest Spacer Tales out of the Philim sector, though. The planet Kashi was supposedly home to the Kashi Mare, a civilization who had a mighty dark side amulet that was the key to the power of the ruling Kashi Mare dynasty. In the early Republic era, a Force adept named Reda Jalus stole the amulet. Later, wishing to atone for the dark deeds she had committed with the amulet's power, she returned to Kashi to give the amulet back. But that very day, the star of the Kashi system went supernova. Legend has it that the Kashi Mare amulet somehow survived, flung to some unknown world by the blast. and that the Force-sensitive Kashimir Zendor, who had been off-world at the time of the Nova, went on a quest to recover it. Woo! Another great spacer story is Naldar. Naldar has a local monarchy that rose up in rebellion against the Empire during the Midrim Offensive, but got subjugated during the Midrim Retreat. The royal family were executed for their rebellion, but Princess Villa escaped and enlisted the aid of Luke Skywalker to help lead the planet in rebellion again at some time between the battles of Endor and Jakku. Not verified, probably just a story, but toppling the government of a relatively minor planet like this is definitely something Luke Skywalker could do in like a week, so maybe. The planet in Felim sector you're most likely familiar with is Jabeam, and you are most likely familiar with it from its participation in the Hidden Path that helped Jedi escape the Empire. Obi-Wan Kenobi visited there briefly during the Imperial era, right before it was attacked by Imperial forces. I realize it's probably because no one ever writes it down when Obi-Wan Kenobi visits a planet and everything was fine, but seriously, I would not want to be around this guy. Trouble seems to follow him around. Jabeam had a lot of grievances with the Republic by the late Republic era. According to disgruntled Jabeamians, the Republic had just kinda sat and watched during the Brain Rot Plague, hadn't intervened in a Trandoshan bandit crisis that got so bad they were openly ruling sections of the planet, and then a Lithian pirate siege after the petty bandit kings exposed how vulnerable Jabeam was. Jabeam paid their taxes to the core and didn't get much in return, so it's not surprising they went CIS, especially given their location not too far from the CIS capital territories in the Tion cluster. They formed part of what was called the Foundry of the CIS, a series of major industrial worlds near the Tion cluster, which served as the main source of reinforcements and resupply in the Spinwards Theater. Republic forces used the planet of Handooine as a staging area for their attack on Jabeam, and supposedly Obi-Wan and Anakin led the Republic against Asajj Ventress there, although this isn't as well sourced as some of the other confrontations. That might be because it was kind of a disaster, though, with the initial Republic attack fought off, and the closest thing to a victory being that they were able to evacuate without losing their entire army. Jabeam would remain in Separatist hands and become one of the targets of the Outer Rim sieges late in the war. The Jabeamians never stopped opposing the Republic-turned-Empire, with guerrilla forces there skirmishing with Imperial troops throughout the entire Imperial era. Greetings, my name is Chamomile, and this is an exploration of the entire galaxy sector by sector. Today, we're looking at the Shadola sector in 12th Cerulean Spear Command. Shadola sector is near Hutt space, and Skibo is a vacation spot for certain Hutts. Skibo calls itself the Jewel of the Five Systems. What are the five systems, you ask? Good question. I don't know. I guess we can assume Skibo is one of them. The cunning among you have no doubt already deduced that there are four others. No clue what those are. Gorka and Anakra the Hutts honeymooned on Skibo when Anakra was kidnapped by a Skaver swoop gang. They held her for ransom for 1,000,000 credits, and Gorga hired Boba Fett to rescue Anakra. Allegedly. Also allegedly, Crozerbia is a planet in Shadola sector home to the Crozerbian species. They fought an internecine conflict on their home planet for 200 years, until an Ithorian named Zorneth fed them steaks laced with uppers, and the Crozerbians made peace that very same day. This is standard stoner jokes, which are never like clever academic satire of real historical events, so my guess is that Crozerbia probably doesn't even exist. The planet Gand is home to the Gand species, who breathe an ammonia-rich atmosphere rather than the oxygen-based atmosphere that's considered habitable for the vast majority of carbon-based animals. The Gand are probably most famous for their Findsmen, an order of sheriffs/shamans who would use augury to track down fugitives. It's suspected this is some kind of Force tradition, although that's never been verified. Gand has traditionally been an independent world. The Galactic Republic asked Gand nicely to join, and they said no. The Galactic Empire was more forceful, but unsurprisingly, Gand broke away during the disintegration of the Empire and did not join the New Republic. Greetings, my name is Chamomile, and this is an exploration of the entire galaxy sector by sector. Today, we're looking at the Cerulean sector of 12th Cerulean Spear Command. This sector is home to Lithia, homeworld of the Lithian Pirates, a planet which is otherwise not at all important, but that name sure sounds cool. Cerulean sector is allegedly home to the planet of Laboy 2, home to a sentient species of furry wolf snakes, a tribal, predatory species who were never able to adapt galactic standard technology because they lack limbs. The chimeric alien appearance is pretty standard for spacer tales, and although there is some kind of actual explanation for why these guys never joined the greater galactic community, it's still weird that a species on the doorstep of Hutt space, where the border between the Hutts and Tion, including after Tion was part of the Republic, went back and forth multiple times, and no one ever really paid these guys or their home planet much attention. But would it be 12 Cerulean if there was only one unconfirmed alien species? The Tefan are blue-skinned, bulgy-eyed aliens supposedly from the planet Tefau. There are a handful of Tefans who come up in Tales of the Outer Rim as, like, some random banker or something, but they're one of those species that supposedly deposited money for Lando Calrissian or forwarded a call for Han Solo or whatever. It's always suspicious when the only record of a species' existence is a brief encounter with a celebrity scoundrel known to encourage spacer tales about their most roguish years. A confirmed species from Cerulean sector is the Hauks. Hauks are big burly aliens, sometimes said to be the strongest humanoids in the galaxy, the only species stronger than a Wookiee, but spacers love their superlatives, and as far as I know this has never been studied, so grain of salt. The Hauks are actually split off into their own Ansuruor subsector, which has separate Senate representation from the rest of Cerulean sector, so not sure why it isn't just the sector then, but officially it is not. My outside guess is that it's because this is one of the sectors added to the Republic after the Fourth Pius Dea Crusade, when the Republic bit off the Hutt Empire's spinmost territories in the early Republic era. The Pius Dea were big on high human culture and had a nasty habit of cramming lots of alien species into a single sector, because hey, all those aliens are basically alike, right? And possibly some subsectors were broken out later on in the Old Republic and especially High Republic eras, when the Republic was more committed to the tradition of sectors being the domain of a particular culture. Cerulean sector is also home to the Ayatra subsector, a planet run by a council of the chiefs of 8 police precincts, which is weirdly meta. Like, the purpose of the police is to enforce the laws of the government, so if the police are the government, then the only purpose of the government is to exist. All governments need to continue existing to achieve any other goal, but it's weird to see a planet with such an open governing tradition where the only purpose is to continue to exist and not to preserve or propagate any kind of ideology like freedom or nobility or whatever. And these 8 precincts were originally 8 distinct military traditions, like the Kalandran Royal Forces, Larathi Guard, and the Jengarden Millennial Warriors, which finally sorted their shit out to unite into a planetary government only in the High Republic era. The Ayatrans rule the subsector of Ayatra, which is part of Cerulean sector despite being, as far as I can tell, exactly like a regular sector in every other way. Salukami is semi-famous for being the home of a clone deserter. A couple of battles were fought there during the Clone Wars, but it was pretty under-garrisoned. When General Grievous went down there early in the war and Obi-Wan Kenobi pursued him, neither side had huge armies lying around to back them up, and they wound up chasing each other around the wilderness for a while before Grievous escaped the planet. At no point was trying to reach Separatist lines ever a goal, so it doesn't seem like the Separatists had any front lines on the planet. The Separatists deployed a bigger army there later in the war, but they got kicked off pretty quick. Stas Ali was patrolling with garrison forces when Order 66 came down. Vespara is in Cerulean sector, home to the Grand Arena where the Hunters of the Outer Rim is filmed, so if you're a fan of that show, then now you know where exactly in the Outer Rim that takes place. Obi-Wan Kenobi went on a mission to the planet of Cerulean in this sector. I bring this up for only 2 reasons. Number 1, the Republic nearly named this sector after Cerulean, which would have been a much better name. And 2, this was after Obi-Wan had his glorious hair, but before he had his glorious beard, and it looks wrong. Satine Kryze thought Obi-Wan should shave his beard, and that's why the Death Watch won the war. Cerulean sector was the site of the border between the furthest extent of the Tian hegemony under Zim the Despot and the Hutt Empire in the era just before the formal establishment of the Republic. One of the more densely populated planets of the region is Bunta, formerly known as Kovari when it was still controlled by the Tianese. After Zim's defeat at Vontor, the planet was recaptured by Cossack the Hutt, and much later renamed after Bunta the Hutt, the general who defeated Zim at Vontor. Bunta Eve is a celebration of Bunta the Hutt's victory over Zim and the height of the Hutt Empire's power in the early Republic era, and is naturally celebrated intensely on Bunta. According to legend, the original Bunta's Eve pod races used Tianese prisoners captured in the wars with Zim who were forced to race, and the losers would be executed. It's not clear if the Bunta Eve celebrations were continuous since the defeat of Zim, although the Hutts claimed they were, but there's some evidence that actually the holiday is a relatively recent effort by the Hutts to recapture the spirit of their glory days. The renaming of the planet Bunta occurred in the High Republic era after the dissolution of the Hutt Empire in favor of the more fuzzy borders of Hutt space, which expand and retract fluidly as Hutt criminal enterprises put down roots unnoticed and eventually get chased off when they grow wild enough for the Republic/Empire to notice and care. But back in the days of Zim the Despot, when Bunta the Hutt captured Kovari, broke the back of the mighty Tian cluster, and stretched the shadow of the Hutts over the entirety of the slice, for half a second, the Hutts nearly had total galactic domination within their grasp. Greetings, my name is Chamomile and this is an examination of the entire galaxy sector by sector. Today we're looking at Theron Sector and 12th Cerulean Spear Command, right on the northern edge of Hutt space. There's a bunch of prisons out here. The Empire had tons of prisons by the time they went mask off because they thought the Death Star would make them invincible, but the Republic had one out here too. Uvu 4 is where the late Republic kept its most dangerous criminals. Story is that Jango Fett broke a guy out of here for information on Komari Vosa and her Bando Gora once, and also that they hosted pod races here for some reason. The pod racing circuit was not entirely legal, so it's not surprising that it was super sketch, but, hosting an event where doing crimes mid-race is allowed and encouraged at a prison seems like a scheme by prison authorities to save on transportation costs. This sector is also allegedly home to Deles 4, a Rebel Alliance prison world. Not New Republic, Rebel Alliance, which speaks to the extent that the rebels were running a full-on nation-state in the Outer Rim after the Battle of Yavin. Despite having a famous prison out here, Theron Sector also has Junkfort Station, a famous shadow port where smuggler, bounty hunters, and other ne'er-do-wells and seldom-do-wells gather to find shady jobs and make shady connections. Junkfort does a lot of illegal ship modifications. It can't service capital ships, but if you've got a Corvette that you want upgraded with military-grade turbo lasers that fell off the back of a truck, Junkfort's got you covered. There's a story that Han Solo went to Junkfort Station after the Battle of Yavin on behalf of the Rebel Alliance, looking for something called a power gem that could be used to build a weapon to destroy the Super Star Destroyer. Something vaguely like that might have happened, but the Rebel Alliance didn't generally go for super weapons the way the Empire did, and I'm positive that if this so-called power gem exists, it has a real name that's much less vague. The Theron Sector was added into the Republic after the Fourth Pius Dea Crusade. You might remember the Third Crusade from Castellar Sector, and although we don't have many details about these crusades, and it's possible that the Third Crusade was a huge success, and by unfortunate coincidence all of its gains were completely undone by the time of the Sith Wars, the evidence suggests the Third Crusade was a miserable failure. On the other hand, the Fourth Crusade successfully pushed the Hutt Empire back from the Tion Cluster to the current modern boundaries of recognized Hutt space. Indeed, while the Hutt Empire still existed 30 crusades later, though note that the majority of the crusades between the 4th and the 34th did not target the Hutts, the Pius Dea era brought an end to the Hutt Empire as an imperialist conquering force and ushered in the transition to the modern Hutt cartels, using criminal networks and economic interests to expand past the recognized borders of Hutt space without making any formal claims or landing any official armies. Jabba the Hutt had enough enforcers on Tatooine to be the de facto ruler for about a century, but he never landed an army or officially overthrew the local government, so neither the Republic nor the Empire ever took it as an act of war, and that strategy of criminal influence over direct conquest is something the Hutts settled on after the Pius Dea conflicts, especially the Fourth Crusade, which went quite well for the Republic. Before the Fourth Crusade, the Hutts controlled what is now the Felim, Suol-Riep, and Theron sectors, and even part of Jospro sector. Suol-Riep and Theron sectors have fallen back under Hutt influence at times, but it's weird to think of Jospro sector as being anywhere near the Hutts' influence. It's mostly a flyover sector, but if you know about it, you probably think of it as being the border between the Tianese and the Republic, and it's kind of insane that the Hutts were up that far spinwards. Theron Sector, on the other hand, is much more traditional Hutt territory, with a lot of planets that still show strong Hutt influence. It's the region of space from which the Hutts launched their attack on the Ash Worlds just before the Tianese War between the Tian hegemony and the Republic, and it was the staging area for the Hutts' attack on Jospro Sector, where they bit off the outlying planets while the Republic was busy fighting the Tianese aristocracy. Alongside places like Castellar Sector, Suol-Riep Sector, and Hala Sector, it's a prime example of how the modern Hutt cartels often rule large chunks of their former territory that has nominally been ruled by the Republic or Empire since the early Republic era. Pius Dea pushed high human culture. It was still democratic. Unlike the Empire, there was never a point where the Senate got dissolved completely, and so they made a lot of room for good aliens, which mostly meant rich aliens from in or near the core worlds, like the Kamasi or Duros, ones with influence in the Senate. Outer Rim aliens could go fuck themselves, though, so when sectors like Theron Sector got incorporated into the Republic, a bunch of species homeworlds got lumped together into one sector. Despite using the speciest, slave-owning evil of the Hutts as an example of the despicableness of alien cultures, something that is naturally repugnant to humans in our high human culture, the Pius Dea pretty much picked up the speciesism where the Hutts left off, cramming tons of aliens into Theron Sector, which was rigged to minimize their political influence on the Senate, without giving them the option to become independent systems. Pius Dea dictated these aliens' future to them in basically the exact same way the Hutts did. And, in fairness, the democratic institutions and liberal expectations of the core worlds put limits on the level of overt exploitation and humiliation that the aliens of Theron Sector could be subjected to compared to what the Hutts did. But still, the people who wouldn't shut up about high human culture were noticeably worse at actually upholding traditional core worlds values, like the Sector as a semi-sovereign cultural domain. So, what kind of aliens got shoved in here? The Rykos of planet Novor 23 and the Benishi of planet Benish have no physical description whatsoever, so as usual I suspect that these are actually terms for natives of these planets, regardless of species, that have been misinterpreted as species names. The Tamarians of planet Tamar allegedly have air sacs that allow them to survive in vacuum for short periods of time. A lot of species have those. They're called lungs. Presumably the Tamarian air sacs are somehow vacuum sealed to prevent the air being sucked out of you and allow them to survive longer in space than the minute or two tops that humans can make it, but there's no other physical description of them, so I'm inclined to believe this is just a spacer tale or a misunderstanding. Nelidians are allegedly short brown humanoids from Nelid, a planet of desert mesas covered in swirling orange fog. This is about the only picture we have of them. It's not the craziest story, but sufficiently underdocumented that I give it 50-50 odds whether these guys are real. The Vathkree from the planet of the same name are allegedly rock people, like the Thing. This might just be a spacer tale, but, I mean, Vintians, so nothing's impossible. The Cedrians are supposedly a species of cool water centaur guys whose homeworld was entirely undiscovered because it was shielded from galactic explorers by a powerfully force-sensitive distributed intelligence in the planet's coral reefs, which the Cedrians call the Golden Sun and worship as a god. Supposedly, the Rebel Alliance discovered the planet and convinced the ruling High Priest of the Golden Sun to join the rebellion, thwarting an attempted coup by an isolationist faction, and the Cedrians are now a part of the New Republic as part of the Theron Sector. Sounds like a spacer tale to me. Yes, there's an explanation for why this planet wasn't discovered until very late into history, and the explanation isn't so insane that I dismiss it out of hand, but I'm always skeptical of these stories that just so happen to take place during major, dramatic events that everyone knows about, like the Galactic Civil War or the Clone Wars. You'd expect more of these things where someone stumbles across a well-hidden world to occur at some random point in long eras of peace, like the High Republic or the parts of the Old Republic in lulls between Sith Wars, or at least to happen as the result of merchant spacers who outnumber rebels and Imperials both by a couple orders of magnitude. The Death Elves of planet Off-El are a canine species with the unique power to bend light around themselves, thus making them better at blending into shadows. That property has been replicated in a couple of armor technologies like Shadow Silk, and it generally comes with the trade-off that you can't build it into armor that's any good as actual armor, a trade-off that the Death Elves do not avoid, but you wouldn't expect their fur to be absorbing a whole lot of blaster bolts in the first place. Af-El is also a high-gravity world, which makes the Death Elf strong as hell, but also it's really expensive to get off their planet because regular repulsor lifts can't cancel enough gravity to just fly up into space like on most planets, so you have to use crazy launch catapults. I want to know what the hell is going on with this planet. The native species have somehow naturally evolved light-bending power on the bleeding edge of armor tech, the gravity well is deeper than a Tabana giant's, and yet the surface is still rocky enough to be able to walk around on. What the hell? The species in Theron Sector you've heard of, though, are the Weequay of planet Cerulean. Cerulean is a desert planet prone to volcanic activity whose main liquid surface is acid seas. It's also an agri-world. Somehow the Weequay make that work. The Weequay have thousands of gods who are associated with physical forces like volcanoes, oceans, or the moon. That's not politically relevant to anything, I just think it's cool. The Weequay have been attacked by two other species from the Hutt sphere of influence, the Hooks from Cerulean Sector and the Nikto from inside Hutt space. The Hutts use these species conflicts to try and blackmail planets into submitting to them, promising to bring stability through brute force, freezing conflicts on terms guaranteed to breed long-term resentment between both parties in order to ensure that only the continuing domination of Hutt overlords can enforce peace between them. That way, anytime the Hutts are forced to recede back into their de jure borders by a resurgent republic, it leaves behind wars and calamities in their wake. In the specific case of Cerulean, the Hook have extensive colonies on Cerulean, and the Hutts use both economic incentive and brute force to keep them as separate from Weequay society as possible, while also forcing the Weequay to recognize borders that turn over sacred sites to Hook colonists, who absolutely do not care what god supposedly lives inside that mountain and will mine the shit out of it for even the cheapest ores. When the Hutts retreat, the war is inevitable. Unless, of course, the core worlds are feeling more militant than usual. The Hutt strategy of encouraging species wars that only brute force can contain might work pretty well against the Republic, that's trying to use economic leverage to encourage people to play nice by threatening to cut off their bennies if they cause a mess. If the Hutts can stoke enough special hatred, the economic incentives will be overwhelmed. It worked less well against the Empire, which is perfectly happy to provide the brute force themselves, and left 2 Star Destroyers parked above Cerulean at all times, presumably one to keep an eye on the weak way and one to keep an eye on the hook. The Nikto didn't have a significant population on the planet, they raided from across the border in Hutt space, so both Star Destroyers would just blast any Nikto they saw on sight, and that had the Nikto angle covered. The Empire was ultimately pretty stupid and dysfunctional, but there is something satisfying about watching Hutt influence grow through the cracks of the intricate economic incentive structures the Republic built like meticulous clockwork, and then the Empire just dropped a brick on all of it.